The Anunnaki emerge from the deepest currents of Mesopotamian consciousness, woven into the very fabric of humanity's first literate civilization. Their names appear pressed into clay tablets nearly 5,000 years old, inscribed by Sumerian scribes working in the shadow of massive temple towers that rose above the flat Mesopotamian plain like mountains of human ambition. These were not aliens, not visitors from distant stars, but something far more profound. They were the gods themselves, the divine assembly who shaped the destiny of the world's first cities, the celestial powers who decreed the fates of kings and commoners alike. Before we begin this journey through the depths of ancient history, I invite you to become part of our community of history lovers. If you find value in these carefully researched stories that blend scholarly accuracy with the comfort of a bedtime tale, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and press that like button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these long-form historical explorations, and it helps others discover the true stories behind the myths. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the ancient world. Now let's begin. The word Anunnaki itself carries within it the weight of cosmic hierarchy. In the Sumerian language, dead for millennia yet preserved in countless clay tablets, the term breaks down into revealing components, and signifies heaven, sky, the unreachable vault above, and simultaneously names the supreme god who ruled that celestial realm. Una derives from the word for prince, for nobility, for those born to power and authority. Ki means earth, land, the solid ground beneath human feet. Together, these elements create a title that translates most accurately as princely offspring of heaven and earth, or those of divine blood who bridge the cosmic realms. This linguistic structure reveals something essential about how the ancient Mesopotamians conceived their universe. They did not imagine a single, distant, unknowable deity. Instead, they envisioned a complex bureaucracy of divine powers, each with specific domains, relationships, and responsibilities. The Anunnaki represented the highest tier of this celestial administration, the great gods whose decisions rippled through reality itself, determining everything from the flooding of rivers to the rise and fall of dynasties. The earliest written references to the Anunnaki appear in temple administrative documents from the city of Uruk, dating to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era. These weren't theological treatises or mythological narratives but practical records. Lists of offerings made to the Anunnaki who judge, inventories of sacrifices dedicated to the great Anunnaki of heaven and earth. Even in these mundane accounting tablets, we glimpse a society already organized around the worship of these powerful beings, a civilization that understood itself as existing in constant relationship with forces that transcended human comprehension. By the time scribes compiled the Sumerian king list around 2,100 years before the Common Era, drawing on traditions centuries older, the theological role of the Anunnaki had achieved full articulation. This remarkable document begins with a statement of cosmic significance. When kingship descended from heaven, not emerged from human organization, not developed through social evolution, but descended, given from above, bestowed by divine authority. The Anunnaki represented that authority, the celestial council that determined which cities would prosper, which kings would rule, which peoples would flourish or fade. The antediluvian section of the king list, describing rulers before the Great Flood, assigns impossibly long reigns to the earliest kings, tens of thousands of years for single rulers. Modern pseudo-archaeologists have seized upon these numbers as evidence of alien longevity, of extraterrestrial Anunnaki living far beyond human lifespans. But scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature recognize these extended reigns as a common mythological device, similar to the extreme ages given to biblical patriarchs before the flood. These numbers serve not to record historical fact but to establish mythic time, to separate the sacred past from the historical present, to mark these earliest rulers as existing in an age when heaven and earth were closer, when the divine and human realms interpenetrated more directly. The theological sophistication of Anunnaki worship becomes apparent in texts like the Hymn to Enlil, composed around 2,000 years before the Common Era but preserving much older traditions. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Air, ranked as the supreme executive authority among the Anunnaki, the god who separated heaven from earth and who governed the space between. The hymn describes him as the Great Mountain, an epithet that simultaneously references his temple in Nippur, built on a raised platform like an artificial mountain, and his cosmic status as the immovable foundation of divine order. Enlil, whose pronouncements cannot be altered, whose lifted eye scans the land, whose raised light searches the heart of all lands, the hymn declares. This isn't the language of alien overlords but of divine sovereignty understood in terms native to Mesopotamian culture. Enlil's power manifests through his word, through pronouncement and decree, through the same mechanisms that earthly kings employed. He governs through a celestial bureaucracy mirroring the temple and palace administrations that organized Mesopotamian society. The Anunnaki assembled in divine council to make their most consequential decisions. The Atrahasis epic, our most complete account of the Great Flood, describes this assembly in detail. When humanity has grown too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, Enlil proposes a solution: let the deluge come down on their noise. But the decision requires consensus. The gods debate. Enki, the clever god of fresh water and wisdom, objects. Other deities express concern. Eventually the council reaches its verdict, and the flood is decreed. This pattern of divine governance through assembly and debate appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. When the goddess Inanna wishes to descend to the underworld, she must obtain permission. When Marduk seeks supreme authority over the gods in the Enuma Elish, he must prove his worthiness before the assembled Anunnaki, who then vote to grant him kingship. These aren't autocratic space aliens imposing their will but deities operating within a complex system of cosmic law and divine protocol. The Anunnaki's relationship to humanity was fundamentally one of service and obligation. Humans existed to serve the gods, to maintain their temples, to work the fields that belonged to divine estates, to ensure the continued functioning of the rituals and sacrifices that fed celestial appetites. This wasn't slavery in the modern sense but sacred duty, the very purpose for which humanity had been created. The Atrahasis and various creation myths explicitly state that humans were formed from clay and divine blood to relieve the gods of labor, to perform the agricultural and construction work that maintained cosmic order. In return, the gods provided protection, prosperity, and meaning. A city whose patron deity was powerful and well-served would flourish. Crops would grow. Enemies would be defeated. Babies would be born healthy. The relationship was reciprocal, transactional in the best sense. Both parties had obligations, both parties benefited. When disaster struck, when drought withered the fields or floods destroyed the crops or disease swept through the population, it indicated divine displeasure. The Anunnaki had withdrawn their favor, and only renewed devotion and proper ritual could restore the relationship. The archaeological evidence supports this understanding completely. Mesopotamian cities organized themselves around massive temple complexes that dominated the urban landscape. The ziggurat of Uar, dedicated to the moon god Nana, still rises from the Iraqi desert, its mud-brick bulk testifying to the enormous resources devoted to divine service. Thousands of clay tablets from temple archives document the economic power these institutions wielded: vast agricultural estates, workshops producing textiles and metalwork, stores of grain and oil, herds of sheep and cattle, all managed by temple administrators acting on behalf of the god who owned everything. The Eanna temple complex in Uruk, dedicated to Inanna, employed hundreds of people in various capacities: priests and priestesses performing daily rituals, scribes keeping records, craftsmen producing cult objects, agricultural workers farming temple lands, guards protecting temple wealth. This wasn't a small side operation but the economic heart of the city, and similar complexes existed in every major Mesopotamian settlement. The Anunnaki, as the gods who owned these institutions, were the ultimate power behind Mesopotamian civilization. Individual gods within the Anunnaki collective had specific domains and personalities that emerged clearly from the textual evidence. Enki, god of the Abzu, the cosmic ocean of fresh water beneath the earth, was characterized by wisdom, creativity, and a general fondness for humanity. When other gods sought to destroy or punish humans, Enki typically intervened to save them. He taught humanity the arts of civilization: agriculture, writing, mathematics, magic. His cleverness solved problems that force could not. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, embodied fertility and birth. She assisted in creating humanity, molding the first people from clay. Women called upon her during childbirth, the most dangerous moment in a Mesopotamian woman's life. Her temples served as sanctuaries where the sick sought healing, where the barren prayed for children, where the vulnerable found protection. Inanna, later known as Ishtar in Akkadian sources, combined aspects that modern sensibilities find contradictory. She was both the goddess of love and war, of sexuality and violence, of attraction and destruction. Her myths describe her as bold, ambitious, dangerous, and unpredictable. She could bestow prosperity or devastation with equal ease. Her cult involved sacred prostitution, ritual sexuality that blurred the boundaries between divine and human, that brought worshippers into direct contact with divine power through the most intimate human experience. These characterizations weren't arbitrary. They reflected genuine religious experience, philosophical reflection on the nature of divinity, and practical observation of how power operated in the world. The gods behaved like the forces they represented. Enlil, the storm god, could be sudden and destructive like wind. Enki, the god of fresh water, brought life and wisdom. Inanna, goddess of love and war, embodied the passionate intensity of both sexual desire and martial fury. The Anunnaki judged the dead, serving as the supreme court of the underworld. This role appears most clearly in the myth of Inanna's descent. When the goddess descends to the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, she must pass through 7 gates, removing an article of clothing or divine power at each. Finally, she arrives naked and powerless before the throne where, the 7 Anunnaki, the judges, pronounced judgment before her. They looked at her with the look of death. They spoke to her with the word of wrath. They shouted at her with the shout of guilt. The afflicted woman was turned into a corpse. And the corpse was hung on a hook. This judicial function wasn't separate from their role as great gods but integral to it. The Anunnaki maintained cosmic order, which required judgment, accountability, consequences for actions. Even the gods themselves could be judged, as Inanna discovers. Death was the ultimate equalizer, the one fate no one could escape, and the Anunnaki presided over that final transition. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought was neither heaven nor hell but a dreary shadow realm where all souls went regardless of moral behavior. The quality of one's afterlife depended not on virtue but on proper burial and having living descendants who would pour libations and make offerings. This democratic view of death, where kings and slaves ended up in the same dusty darkness, influenced later religious traditions including biblical Judaism, which originally had no concept of heaven as reward or hell as punishment. By the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 years before the Common Era, theological reflection had produced increasingly sophisticated understandings of the Anunnaki. Texts explore questions of divine justice, theodicy, and the problem of undeserved suffering. The Babylonian theodicy, structured as a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend, directly addresses why the Anunnaki allow the righteous to suffer while the wicked prosper. The text offers no easy answers but acknowledges the difficulty, ultimately concluding that divine wisdom exceeds human understanding, that the Anunnaki's decisions follow principles beyond mortal comprehension. This intellectual honesty, this willingness to sit with difficult questions rather than offering false comfort, marks Mesopotamian theology as genuinely sophisticated. The gods weren't simplistically good or evil but complex, powerful, sometimes inscrutable. Justice existed but operated on scales and timelines that didn't always match human expectations. The righteous might suffer, the wicked might prosper, and the reasons remained hidden in divine counsels that mortals could not access. The political use of Anunnaki theology becomes explicit in the Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic. This text, probably composed during the reign of Hammurabi or shortly thereafter, tells how Marduk, Babylon's patron god, defeated the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat and created the universe from her corpse. The other gods, grateful for their salvation, elevated Marduk to supreme kingship, granting him authority over all divine decrees. They proclaimed his 50 names, each describing an aspect of his power, in a litany that simultaneously praised Marduk and justified Babylon's political supremacy. The message was clear. Just as Marduk ruled the gods, so Babylon should rule Mesopotamia. Just as the Anunnaki assembled to grant Marduk authority, so the cities of the region should acknowledge Babylonian suzerainty. Religious myth provided divine precedent for political claims, transforming earthly power struggles into cosmic inevitability. Similar patterns appear in Assyrian royal inscriptions, which regularly invoke Ashur, the supreme Assyrian god, as the source of military victory and political authority. Ashur, king of the gods who dwells in the Ahursaghurkara temple, who determines destinies, granted to me weapons without equal and gave me victory over my enemies. The Anunnaki's power to decree fates translated directly into royal ideology. Kings ruled because the gods had decreed it, conquered because divine power flowed through them, deserved obedience because they represented celestial authority on earth. Understanding the Anunnaki as political as well as religious constructs doesn't diminish their significance. All religion intertwines with politics, all theology serves social functions, all myths explain and justify existing power structures while simultaneously offering means to critique or transform them. The Mesopotamians understood this. Their sophisticated society recognized that divine and human authority were inseparable, that religious practice and political order mutually reinforced each other, that the temple and the palace were different manifestations of the same organizing principles. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding. When excavators uncovered the temple library at Nippur, they found thousands of tablets spanning more than 2 millennia. These texts show continuity in how the Anunnaki were conceived alongside gradual evolution in emphasis and interpretation. Earlier texts focus more on their role as active participants in creation and cosmic events. Later texts increasingly emphasize their judicial functions and their role as guarantors of social order. The personal names people gave their children provide another window into popular religion. Names like Enlil is my strength, or chosen by Inanna, or Enki has heard my prayer, appear frequently in administrative documents, legal contracts, and funerary inscriptions. These weren't formal theological statements but evidence of lived religion, of how ordinary people related to the Anunnaki, of which gods they called upon in times of need or thanksgiving. Hymns and prayers recovered from various sites show the emotional range of Mesopotamian piety. Some texts overflow with praise and devotion. Enlil, whose word brings prosperity, whose lifted eye brings abundance. Others express desperation and complaint. How long, O my goddess, will you neglect me? I have called upon you, but you do not answer. Still others wrestle with theodicy and doubt. The wicked are exalted, the righteous are brought low. Why do the Anunnaki allow this? This diversity of religious expression argues against any simple characterization of Mesopotamian religion as primitive or naive. The people who worshipped the Anunnaki were capable of sophisticated theological reflection, profound devotional feeling, honest doubt, and creative mythological imagination. They weren't primitive ancestors waiting for alien enlightenment but fully human populations grappling with the eternal questions that still occupy us. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? What gives life meaning? How should we live? The Anunnaki provided one set of answers to these questions, answers that made sense within Mesopotamian cultural context, that explained their agricultural economy, justified their political hierarchies, gave meaning to their labor, offered hope in times of crisis, and connected individual lives to cosmic significance. These gods were never aliens from planet Nibiru, never genetic engineers creating human slaves, never visitors who would return from the stars. They were always and only what they claimed to be, the great gods who decreed destinies, the divine assembly who governed the cosmos, the children of heaven whose will shaped earthly existence. In the silence between stars and soil, in the sacred space where myth meets history, the Anunnaki wait not for return but for understanding. They ask not for belief but for accurate comprehension, for recognition of what they truly were, humanity's first attempt to organize the divine, to create bureaucracy in heaven that mirrored bureaucracy on earth, to explain through cosmic drama why life was hard and beautiful and brief and meaningful all at once. As you drift now toward sleep, let this understanding settle into your consciousness. The Anunnaki were never more or less than gods, and gods were never simple things but complex cultural creations that shaped and reflected the societies that worshipped them. The truth requires no embellishment, no alien visitors, no ancient astronauts. The truth is profound enough. Humanity created civilization, including the religious systems that gave that civilization meaning, and the Anunnaki stand as testament to our ancestors' creativity, intelligence, and deep need to understand their place in an often incomprehensible universe. Long before pyramids touched the sky, before philosophy flourished in Greece, before Rome dreamed of empire, there was Mesopotamia. The name itself whispers of water and abundance. It comes to us from ancient Greek, meaning quite literally between the rivers. Those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowed then as they flow now, though their courses have shifted over millennia, like restless sleepers turning in bed. Imagine this land as it was 6,000 years ago. Not the desert we see in photographs today but a place alive with possibility. The rivers flooded seasonally, bringing rich silt that turned the landscape into a patchwork of green and gold. In the areas that remained dry, date palms grew in orderly groves, their shadows offering respite from the relentless sun. Wheat and barley flourished in irrigated fields, while in the marshlands, reeds grew tall enough to hide a standing person. This was not an easy land. It demanded ingenuity, cooperation, and constant vigilance. The floods that brought life could also bring destruction. The same sun that ripened crops could parch the earth until it cracked. There were no convenient mountains providing stone for building, no forests offering endless timber. What the land gave in abundance was mud, clay, and the river water itself. From these simple materials, humanity would build wonders. The people who settled here, whom we call Sumerians, appeared in the historical record as if from nowhere. Their language, preserved in clay tablets that somehow survived 5,000 years, bears no clear relation to any other known tongue. They were not related linguistically to the Semitic peoples who later lived alongside them, nor to the Indo-Europeans who would eventually spread across much of the ancient world. They simply were, arriving in southern Mesopotamia sometime before the 4th millennium before the Common Era, bringing with them technologies and organizational systems that would transform human civilization. Picture the earliest Sumerian settlements. Not grand cities yet, but clusters of reed houses much like those still built by marsh dwellers in southern Iraq today. Gradually, these humble structures gave way to more permanent buildings, constructed from sun-dried mud bricks. As communities grew, they organized around temples, massive structures that dominated the landscape and served as economic, religious, and administrative centers all at once. By around 3,200 years before the Common Era, these settlements had evolved into true cities. Uruk, perhaps the greatest of them, may have housed as many as 40,000 people, a staggering number for its time. Imagine walking through its streets in those early days. Narrow passages between thick-walled houses, the smell of bread baking, the sound of copper being hammered, children playing in the dust. And always, dominating everything, the temple rising above the city like a mountain, its bulk visible from miles away across the flat plain. These cities weren't isolated. They traded extensively, reaching far beyond Mesopotamia for materials they lacked. Timber came from the Lebanon mountains. Precious stones like lapis lazuli traveled from as far away as Afghanistan. Copper ore was imported from Anatolia and possibly Oman. The Sumerians created vast trade networks that would make modern economists nod in recognition. But what truly set the Sumerians apart, what makes them worthy of our wonder even today, was their invention of writing. Around 3,400 years before the Common Era, temple administrators in Uruk began pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, creating the world's first writing system. Initially, these marks were simple, representations of commodities like grain or oil, records of temple transactions. But human ingenuity being what it is, the system evolved rapidly. Within a few centuries, cuneiform script, as we now call it, could express complex ideas, record laws, preserve prayers, and immortalize poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, was written in this script. Legal codes, astronomical observations, medical texts, love poems, bitter complaints, accounting records, all were pressed into clay that would outlast the empires that created them. The discovery of these tablets in the 19th century was nothing short of miraculous. Imagine being a British or French explorer, wandering through what seemed like empty desert, investigating massive mounds that locals had picked over for centuries. These mounds, called tells, were the accumulated remains of ancient cities, each generation building atop the rubble of the last until the city stood on its own refuse like a mountain of memory. When archaeologists began systematically excavating these sites in the mid-1800s, they were searching primarily for artifacts to fill museums and for evidence to support biblical narratives. What they found exceeded any expectation. Palaces emerged from the sand, their walls still bearing reliefs of ancient kings and gods carved with stunning artistry. Libraries appeared, rooms filled with thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, each one a voice from the ancient world. At Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, archaeologists discovered the library of Ashurbanipal, containing over 30,000 tablets covering every aspect of knowledge in the ancient world. At Ur, the excavations revealed royal tombs of breathtaking richness, filled with golden artifacts and evidence of elaborate burial ceremonies. At Nippur, religious center of Sumer, layer upon layer of temples testified to continuous worship spanning thousands of years. The physical act of uncovering these sites was grueling work. The Iraqi climate showed no mercy to European archaeologists unaccustomed to its extremes. Summer temperatures could reach levels that made metal tools too hot to touch. Winter brought cold rains that turned excavation sites into seas of mud. Diseases like malaria and dysentery claimed lives. Political instabilities made the work dangerous. Yet still they came, driven by the tantalizing promise of recovering lost worlds. What they recovered transformed our understanding of human history. Here was clear evidence that civilization had not begun with Greece and Rome, as Europeans had long assumed. Here were cities, laws, literature, art, mathematics, astronomy, all flourishing when Europe was populated by scattered farming villages. The Mesopotamians had invented the wheel, developed sophisticated irrigation systems, created the first known postal system, and established the concept of the 7-day week. They measured time by water clocks and sundials. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, a mathematical decision we still live with today. They developed advanced medical knowledge, documenting treatments for various ailments with a mixture of practical understanding and religious ritual. Their mathematics used a base 60 number system, which gave us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and explains why we still measure angles in degrees derived from multiples of 60. In their cities, different social classes coexisted in relative proximity. Wealthy merchants lived in large multi-room houses organized around central courtyards. Artisans, scribes, and traders occupied more modest dwellings. Even slaves, while certainly not equal, were protected by certain legal rights. Women could own property, engage in business, and in some circumstances, divorce their husbands. The legal code of Uarnamu, dating to around 2,100 years before the Common Era, actually predates the famous Code of Hammurabi and shows a sophisticated understanding of justice that sought to prevent abuse of power. The Sumerians understood themselves as intermediaries between earth and heaven. They built ziggurats, massive step towers that physically connected the earthly realm with that of the gods. The greatest of these, the ziggurat of Uar, still stands today, its bulk imposing even in ruins. At its height, it would have been accessible only to the highest priests, who climbed its stairs to reach the sacred chamber at the summit where the god was believed to descend to meet with his servants. Everything in Sumerian society revolved around the gods. The city itself was understood to belong to its patron deity. The king was merely the god's steward, managing divine property and ensuring that the god's will was carried out. Vast agricultural lands belonged to the temples, worked by dependent laborers who in return received rations and protection. The temple served as bank, employer, welfare system, and spiritual center all at once. The year was structured around religious festivals. The most important of these, the New Year festival, lasted 11 days and involved elaborate rituals including the ritual humiliation and reinvestiture of the king, processions of divine statues through the streets, sacred marriages enacted by priests and priestesses representing gods and goddesses, and communal celebrations that brought the entire city together in shared purpose. This was the world into which the Anunnaki were born, not as flesh and blood, but as concepts, as names given to the forces that shaped existence. To understand them, we must first understand the cosmology of the people who worshipped them, the mental universe in which these deities made sense. The Sumerians saw the cosmos as a carefully ordered structure. The universe had always existed, they believed, but in the beginning it was undifferentiated chaos. Heaven and earth were joined together until the god Enlil separated them, carrying off the earth while his father entook the sky. This act of separation created the space in which life could exist, the gap between perfect order above and earthly existence below. 3 levels comprised the universe: heaven, where the gods dwelt among the stars; earth, where humans lived and worked; and the underworld, a dark realm of shadows where all souls eventually traveled regardless of how they had lived. There was no hell of punishment in Mesopotamian thought, no heaven of eternal reward. Death was the great equalizer, and the afterlife was universally grim, a place of dust and darkness where even the greatest kings and queens existed as shadows of their former selves. In this cosmos, gods and humans were not so different as we might expect. The gods needed food, they slept, they married and had children, they quarreled and made alliances, they even grew old in some texts, though they didn't die. They were simply more powerful versions of humans with superhuman strength and knowledge, but not the omniscient, omnipotent deities of later monotheistic traditions. And among these gods, the Anunnaki held a special place. They were the great gods, the children of the Sky Father himself. They were the gods who decided fates, who shaped the course of human events, who assembled in council to make decisions that would echo through generations. But who were they really? What did their name mean? What functions did they serve in the divine hierarchy? And most importantly, what do the actual ancient texts, the tablets written by Sumerian and Akkadian scribes thousands of years ago, tell us about them? In the stillness of a museum storage room, clay tablets sleep. Some are barely larger than your palm, others as substantial as a laptop computer. Their surfaces are covered with tiny wedge-shaped marks, pressed into soft clay while it was still wet, then baked hard either by design or by the fires that destroyed the buildings where they were kept. Each tablet is a voice from the ancient world, and some of them speak directly about the beings we call the Anunnaki. The name itself holds keys to understanding. In the Sumerian language, it appears as Dianunna, sometimes written more fully as Dianunnaki or Dianunnakuni. The prefix D was the determinative sign for divinity, the way a scribe indicated that what followed was the name of a god or group of gods. Anunna derives from Anuna, which scholarly consensus translates as offspring of an, or princely offspring or of royal blood, and was the supreme deity, the god of the heavens, whose name literally meant heaven, or sky, in Sumerian. He was the father of gods, ancient even by the reckoning of the ancient Mesopotamians themselves. His consort varied in different traditions. Sometimes she was Ki, the earth, a figure so ancient and foundational that she barely appears as an individual deity but rather as a concept. Other texts name her as Untu, the sky goddess. The Anunnaki were understood to be their children, the divine offspring of the primordial coupling of heaven and earth. This means quite simply that the Anunnaki were gods. Not a separate category of being, not visitors from another planet, not ancient astronauts in spacesuits, but gods. They were the major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the great gods who controlled the forces of nature and decreed the destinies of humanity. How many were there? The texts give varying numbers. Some speak of 50 Anunnaki associated with the city of Eridu, an ancient religious center that the Sumerians believed to be the first city ever created. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, mentions 300 Anunnaki assigned to duty in the heavens and 300 assigned to the underworld, for a total of 600. But these are likely symbolic numbers rather than precise counts. The truth is that Anunnaki functioned as a collective term for the major gods rather than a fixed roster with specific membership. Who were these gods? The texts name many of them, and their names will become familiar as we continue our journey. There was Enlil, the god of wind and air, who separated heaven from earth and who became the king of gods in many traditions. His name meant Lord Air, or Lord Wind, and he was worshipped especially in Nippur, where his great temple, the Ikur, dominated the city. Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian, was the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of magic, and of creation. His domain was the Abzu, the cosmic ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the earth, feeding all the springs and rivers. He was crafty, clever, and generally friendly to humanity. In many myths, when other gods sought to punish or destroy humans, Enki intervened to save them. Ninhursag, sometimes identified with the primordial earth goddess Ki, was the mother goddess, the deity of fertility and childbirth. She was involved in the creation of humanity in several myths, molding the first humans from clay. Her name meant Lady of the Mountain, or Lady of the Foothills, and she was one of the most ancient and revered deities in the pantheon. Inanna, called Ishtar in Akkadian, was perhaps the most complex deity of all. She was the goddess of love and sexuality, but also of war and conquest. She could be both nurturing and terrifying, both life-giving and deadly. Her cult was one of the most widespread in Mesopotamia, and her mythology includes some of the most dramatic stories to survive from the ancient world. Sin, the moon god, known as Nana in Sumerian, was worshipped especially at Ur. His very name became the word for moon in later languages. He sailed across the night sky in a boat, and his waxing and waning regulated the Mesopotamian calendar. Shamash, the sun god, known as Utu in Sumerian, was the god of justice and truth, who saw all that happened beneath his light and therefore could judge human behavior with perfect knowledge. These and many others comprised the Anunnaki. They were not a separate species but the pantheon itself, or rather, the senior members of the divine hierarchy. They assembled in council to make important decisions. They decreed fates. They governed the cosmos according to divine law. But what exactly did it mean to decree fates? In Mesopotamian thought, the gods had established what they called the Mi, the divine decrees that governed existence. These were not natural laws in our modern sense, but rather instructions or patterns that determined how things should be. There were Mi for kingship, for war, for music, for sexual intercourse, for truth and falsehood, for descent into the underworld, for countless aspects of existence. The Anunnaki, as the great gods, had the power to assign and reassign these Mi. When they assembled in council, they could decide that a particular king would prosper or fall, that a city would thrive or be destroyed, that a person would live or die. This didn't mean that everything was predetermined in the way later Calvinist theology would understand predestination. Rather, it meant that the gods actively managed the universe, making decisions that affected outcomes. One of the clearest expressions of the Anunnaki's role comes from the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld. In this ancient story, the goddess Inanna decides to visit the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. When she arrives, she's brought before the 7 Anunnaki judges of the underworld. These 7 judge her for her hubris in daring to enter the land of the dead while still living, and they condemn her to death. She's killed and her corpse is hung on a hook, where it begins to rot. Only through the cleverness of Enki, who creates beings that can travel to the underworld without being subject to its rules, is Inanna eventually rescued and restored to life. But the story makes clear the judicial function of the Anunnaki. They were judges, arbiters, those who weighed actions and pronounced verdicts. This judicial role became more pronounced over time, particularly in the Babylonian period. The Anunnaki became increasingly associated with the underworld, where they served as judges of the dead. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Utnapishtim describes the Great Flood, he mentions the Anunnaki as judges who set the land aflame as the storm approached. Later, when the flood waters recede and the gods realize the horror of what they've done, Ishtar and the Anunnaki mourn over the destruction of humanity. In another section of the same epic, Gilgamesh, after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, is referred to with the title Judge of the Anunnaki, suggesting that his destiny after death will be to serve in the underworld alongside these divine beings. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought was not empty. It had a complex bureaucracy, and the Anunnaki formed its supreme court, weighing the dead and assigning them their places in the shadowy realm. But they weren't always associated with death and the underworld. In earlier Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki appear as active participants in earthly affairs. They're present at the creation of humanity. They decree the fates of kings and nations. They're invoked in prayers and praised in hymns. They're the great gods of the pantheon, distinct from lesser spirits and demons but not fundamentally different in kind from other deities. What they definitely were not, according to any ancient Mesopotamian text, was a group of extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru. There is no ancient text that describes the Anunnaki arriving from space. There is no mention of them building pyramids or teaching humans to mine gold. There is no reference to genetic engineering or creating humans as a slave species. These ideas, which have gained such currency in popular culture, come not from ancient Mesopotamia but from 20th century speculation. The actual ancient texts, when read carefully and translated accurately, tell a different story. They tell of gods who were very much part of the Mesopotamian worldview, who functioned within its religious and cosmological framework, who made sense to the people who worshipped them because they explained the forces that shaped their lives. Rain came when the gods willed it. Floods were divine punishment or divine caprice. Disease was often understood as possession by demons sent by angry gods. Military victory proved that your god was stronger than the enemy's god. The king ruled because the gods had chosen him and granted him the me of kingship. Everything that happened in the human world ultimately derived from decisions made in the divine realm. This worldview is fundamentally different from ours. We understand rain as a meteorological phenomenon. We know that floods are caused by excessive rainfall or snowmelt, that their timing can be predicted with increasing accuracy. We understand disease as infection by microorganisms or malfunction of bodily systems. We see military outcomes as dependent on strategy, logistics, technology, and morale rather than divine favor. But the ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world where cause and effect were not always obvious, where the reasons behind events were often mysterious, where life could change in an instant for no apparent reason. The Anunnaki, as gods who decreed fates, provided a framework for understanding these uncertainties. They weren't answers that closed off investigation, but rather a way of making sense of a complex and often frightening world. To truly understand them, we need to delve deeper into the myths that feature them, the creation stories and cosmic dramas that shaped Mesopotamian religious thought. We need to see how these gods functioned in the narratives that explained where everything came from and why the world was the way it was. Every culture has its creation myths, its stories about how the world came to be. These myths serve functions far beyond mere explanation. They establish values, justify social structures, provide meaning, and connect the present to a sacred past. Mesopotamia, with its long history and multiple peoples, had several creation narratives, each revealing different aspects of how the Mesopotamians understood their place in the cosmos. The most complete and elaborate of these is the Enuma Elish, which takes its name from its opening words, meaning when on high. This Babylonian creation epic was not simply a story told for entertainment. It was a sacred text, recited annually during the New Year festival in Babylon. The festival, called Akitu, lasted 11 days and involved the entire city in elaborate rituals meant to renew the cosmic order for another year. Imagine being in Babylon during this festival, perhaps 4,000 years ago. The city is alive with activity. Divine statues are being prepared for procession, their ancient carved features freshly cleaned and anointed with precious oils. The smell of incense hangs thick in the air. Musicians practice, their lyres and drums creating a constant backdrop of sound. Priests moved through their preparations with ritualized precision, every gesture carrying weight and meaning. On the fourth day of the festival in the great temple of Marduk, the high priest begins to recite the Enuma Elish. The audience knows the story. They've heard it every year of their lives. But the annual recitation isn't about learning new information. It's about participating in the sacred narrative, about renewing the covenant between the gods and the city, about reminding themselves of where they came from and why Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, deserves supreme authority over all other deities. The story begins in a time before time, when nothing existed but the primordial waters. There was Apsu the fresh water, male and still. There was Tiamat the salt water, female and chaotic. And there was Mummu, likely the mist that rises from water, serving Apsu as vizier and counselor. These three alone existed, their waters mingling at the place where fresh water meets salt, at the mouths of the great rivers. From the mingling of these primordial waters the gods were born. First came Lamu and Lahamu, whose names relate to silt or mud. Then came Anshar and Kishar, whose names suggest the horizons of heaven and earth. From these came in the sky and Ea, god of wisdom and fresh waters. And these gods, being alive and active, made noise. They disturbed the peace of the primordial waters. Apsu grew tired of their clamor. Day and night, he could not rest because of the noise the young gods made. He complained to Tiamat, suggesting that they destroy their offspring so that peace might return. Tiamat was horrified. These were her children, how could she consent to their destruction? But Apsu, counseled by Mummu, decided to act anyway. Word of this plan reached Ea, cleverest of the gods. He crafted a spell so powerful it could overcome even the primordial waters. He recited it and the spell put Apsu into a deep sleep. While Apsu slumbered, Ea stripped him of his crown and his power, then killed him. Ea established his dwelling place upon Apsu's corpse, making the primordial fresh water his domain. There in his palace built upon the slain body of primordial fresh water, Ea's wife Damkina bore a son. They named him Marduk. The text devotes considerable space to describing Marduk. He was perfect beyond all other gods. Where other gods had 2 eyes, Marduk had 4. Where they had 2 ears, he had 4. When he spoke, fire blazed from his lips. He was the mightiest of the mighty, the wisest of the wise, superior to all who came before. But Tiamat still lived, and her fury at Apsu's murder grew. Persuaded by her other children who resented the younger gods, she prepared for war. She created 11 monsters to serve as her army: horned serpents and mad dogs, scorpion men and storm demons, creatures of nightmare-given form. She appointed one of her sons, Kingu, as her champion, and hung upon his chest the Tablet of Destinies, which gave its bearer supreme authority over fate itself. When the gods learned of Tiamat's preparations, terror seized them. Who could stand against the primordial chaos embodied? And King of the gods tried and failed to confront her. Ea, wisest of gods, could not prevail. The gods assembled in council, desperate and afraid. Marduk, young and mighty, offered to champion the gods. But he set conditions. If he defeated Tiamat and saved the gods, he must become supreme among them. His word must become fate itself. What he decreed must come to pass without question or reversal. The gods, having no alternative, agreed. They tested him by having him command a constellation to disappear and reappear, which he did easily. Then they granted him supreme authority and sent him forth to battle. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat forms the climax of the epic. Marduk equipped himself with weapons both physical and supernatural. He carried a bow and arrows, a mace, lightning, a net to catch his enemy, and the 4 winds to fill his net. As he approached Tiamat, he challenged her to single combat. Tiamat, enraged, accepted. They met, God and primordial chaos, order and disorder, future and past. Tiamat opened her jaws to swallow Marduk, but he released the winds into her mouth. The winds filled her belly until she couldn't close her jaws. Then Marduk shot an arrow that split her heart. Tiamat died, and her army, seeing their champion defeated, tried to flee. But Marduk caught them in his net and imprisoned them. What Marduk did next became the fundamental act of creation. He split Tiamat's corpse in half. From one half, he made the sky, establishing it as a barrier to hold back the waters above. From the other half, he made the earth. He organized the heavens, creating stations for the great gods, establishing the stars as their likenesses, dividing the year into 12 months and assigning 3 stars to each month. He created the moon to mark time and the sun to light the day. Then, looking at the gods who had supported him, Marduk saw that they still had to work to maintain creation. This troubled him, so he conceived a new plan. He asked which of the gods had incited Tiamat to war. They pointed to Kingu, who had worn the Tablet of Destinies. Marduk had Kingu executed, and from his blood, mixed with clay, Ea created humanity. Humans were made for a specific purpose: to serve the gods, to perform the labor of maintaining creation so the gods could rest. Temples would be built and maintained by human hands. Fields would be planted and harvested. Sacrifices would be prepared and offered. Also, the gods could be at leisure. In gratitude for their liberation from labor, the gods built Marduk a temple in Babylon, the Asagila, and a great ziggurat at Anunnaki, whose name meant foundation of heaven and earth. This ziggurat became one of the wonders of the ancient world, rising in 7 stages of different colors, its summit reaching toward the sky, a physical manifestation of the connection between earthly and divine realms. The Enuma Elish concludes with the gods feasting and pronouncing the 50 names of Marduk, each name describing one of his powers or functions. The recitation of these names was itself a magical act, establishing Marduk's authority through the power of language, of naming, of precise categorization. Where are the Anunnaki in this story? They appear throughout, though not always named explicitly. When the text speaks of the gods assembling in council, it's the Anunnaki who gather. When it describes 300 gods of heaven and 300 of the underworld, these are the Anunnaki, assigned their stations by Marduk after his victory. They are the divine assembly, the great gods who must recognize and accept Marduk's supremacy. But the Enuma Elish is a Babylonian text, composed relatively late in Mesopotamian history, probably during the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. Its purpose was partly political, to justify Babylon's supremacy and explain why Marduk, originally a local deity of little significance, had risen to become king of the gods. The earlier Sumerian creation myths tell different stories. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe began with Namu, the primordial sea. Namu gave birth to the sky, and Ki, the earth. These two were initially joined together, inseparable like an egg. From their union came Enlil, the air, the wind, the atmosphere that would eventually separate them. Enlil, proving his might, pushed them apart. And took the sky. Ki remained as earth, and the space between them became the realm where life could exist. This act of separation was fundamental. Before it, there could be no distinct things, no differentiation, no life. After it, the cosmos achieved its basic structure. The Anunnaki appear in these myths as the children of the offspring of heaven, who assisted in organizing the newly created universe. They weren't creators in the primary sense, but organizers, administrators, those who took the raw materials of creation and shaped them into functioning systems. In another Sumerian myth, called the creation of the pickaxe, Enlil creates the tool that will allow humans to dig irrigation channels and cultivate the earth. He separates heaven from earth, then creates the pickaxe and gives it to the Anunnaki, who use it to create a hole in the ground. From this hole, humans emerge, sprouting from the earth like plants. The Anunnaki then put these humans to work, teaching them to use the pickaxe to till the soil. Yet another creation story appears in the text called Enki and Ninmah, sometimes known as the creation of man. In this myth, the gods are exhausted from their labor. They complain bitterly about having to dig canals, maintain irrigation systems, and perform all the work necessary to sustain existence. Enki, lying in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, hears their complaints. His mother, Namu, urges him to create substitute workers who can relieve the gods of their burden. Enki instructs Namu to create humans from clay, the clay that exists in the Abzu. But the process requires the assistance of Ninmah, the mother goddess. Together they shape humans from clay and birth them. However, the first attempts are imperfect. Some humans are born blind, some cannot hold their urine, some are too weak to work. For each imperfect human, Enki finds a role in society. The blind become musicians. Those with physical limitations become court attendants. No one is without purpose, even if they cannot perform heavy labor. Eventually, Enki and Ninmah perfect their creation. They produce humans capable of the work the gods need done. Digging canals, planting fields, building temples, preparing sacrifices. The gods are freed from labor, and humanity assumes its role as the servants of the divine. These creation myths, whether Sumerian or Babylonian, share common themes. The gods exist first. They create humans not from love or loneliness but from need. Humans are servants, their purpose defined by the labor they perform on behalf of the gods. Yet this isn't quite as bleak as it might sound to modern ears. In Mesopotamian thought, service to the gods wasn't slavery in the way we understand the term. It was humanity's fundamental purpose, the reason we exist. To serve the gods well was to live a good life. The temples employed thousands of people, fed them, housed them, gave their lives structure and meaning. The relationship between humans and gods was reciprocal in its own way. Humans provided labor and sacrifices. The gods, in return, maintained cosmic order, brought rain, ensured fertility, and protected their cities from enemies. The Anunnaki, as the great gods, were the primary recipients of this service. Temples dedicated to Enlil, to Enki, to Inanna, to all the major deities, dominated the landscapes of Mesopotamian cities. These weren't simple buildings. They were vast complexes employing hundreds or thousands of people. Priests and priestesses performed daily rituals. Accountants tracked temple wealth, which could be enormous. Farmers worked temple lands. Craftsmen produced goods. Musicians provided sacred music. Everything revolved around serving the god who owned the city. The daily service of the gods followed strict patterns. Each day, the statue of the god had to be awakened with prayers and music. It was washed, anointed with oil, dressed in fine garments, and presented with food offerings. These offerings were substantial: bread, beer, meat, fruits, vegetables, honey. The statue didn't consume the food physically, of course, but the essence of the food was understood to nourish the god, while the physical portions were later distributed to temple personnel as their rations. The statue itself was treated as the living embodiment of the god. It was spoken to directly. It was consulted on important decisions through divination. It was taken on processions through the city so the god could see the people and the people could see their god. During festivals, statues might visit each other, with the god of one city processing to the temple of another god in a neighboring city, strengthening alliances and reaffirming cosmic relationships. All of this might seem strange to us now, worshipping statues, feeding them, clothing them, talking to them. But for the Mesopotamians, these statues were points of contact with divine reality. They weren't simply representations of gods. They were vessels through which gods manifested in the material world. When properly consecrated through the mouth-washing ritual, which involved touching the statue's mouth with special tools while reciting sacred words, the statue became animated by divine presence. The Anunnaki, through their statues, were present in every major city. They witnessed human behavior. They received prayers and offerings. They communicated their will through omens and dreams. They were, in a very real sense, part of daily life, as real to the Mesopotamians as the rivers and the sun. This brings us to a crucial point about understanding ancient religions. We can't judge them by the standards of modern monotheism. The Mesopotamians weren't primitive people with childish beliefs. They were highly sophisticated, with complex theology, elaborate rituals, and deep philosophical questions about the nature of existence. Their beliefs made sense within their worldview, explained their experiences, and provided frameworks for living meaningful lives. The Anunnaki weren't ancient astronauts because the Mesopotamians had no concept of space travel. They weren't genetic engineers because the Mesopotamians had no understanding of genetics. They were gods, powerful beings who controlled natural forces and decreed destinies, and that's how the texts consistently portray them. To read anything else into the ancient sources requires ignoring what they actually say and imposing modern ideas onto ancient words. The sun rises over Uruk, turning the eastern sky from black to deep blue to pale gold. In the great temple of En, priests are already awake, performing the morning rituals that must be completed before the city fully stirs. The statue of En, carved from dark stone and adorned with gold and precious stones, sits in the temple's innermost chamber. Incense smoke curls around it, sweetening the air. A priest approaches, chanting prayers in a language already ancient when these stones were laid. He carries a bowl of water from the Euphrates, water that has been specially purified through filtration and sacred formulas. Gently, as though washing a sleeping child, he washes the statue's face and hands. Another priest follows with perfumed oil, anointing the statue while singing hymns of praise. These rituals, performed every single day without fail, maintain the relationship between the city and its gods. They weren't optional. They weren't ceremonial in the dismissive sense we sometimes use that word today. They were essential as breathing, because they sustained the cosmic order that kept the city alive, the crops growing, the rivers flowing, the enemies at bay. For the ordinary person in ancient Mesopotamia, religious practice permeated every aspect of life. You didn't separate the sacred from the secular because no such separation existed. The king ruled by divine mandate. The law came ultimately from the gods, even if human judges interpreted and applied it. Your livelihood depended on the gods sending rain and preventing floods. Your health was in divine hands. Your children were gifts from the gods, and their deaths, should they die young as so many did, were divine will. But what did an average person actually do, religiously speaking? How did a farmer in a village 20 miles from Uruk, or a potter in a quarter of Babylon, interact with the great gods. For most people, direct interaction with the highest gods was rare. You didn't simply walk into the temple of Enlil and approach his statue. The innermost sanctuaries were restricted to the highest priests, who had undergone years of training and elaborate purification rituals. These spaces were too sacred for common touch, too charged with divine presence for the unprepared. Instead, ordinary people interacted with the gods through intermediaries. The priests performed the daily rituals on everyone's behalf. They were professionals in maintaining divine relationships, trained from childhood in the proper procedures, the correct prayers, the precise gestures. They knew which offerings pleased which gods, which festivals required which preparations, which omens signified which divine moods. But people also had personal gods, lesser deities or protective spirits who looked after individual families or even individuals. These personal gods were more accessible, more concerned with daily problems. You might pray to your personal god about a sick child, about finding a good husband or wife, about success in business. These gods, in turn, could intercede with the greater gods on your behalf, much like a humble citizen might ask a minor official to present their case to the king. Prayers were often quite direct, even transactional. A typical prayer might go something like this: I have brought you this offering of bread and beer. I have praised your name and honored your temple. Now please help me with this problem I'm facing. There was an expectation of reciprocity. The gods needed human service and offerings. Humans needed divine favor and protection. Both sides had responsibilities in the relationship. Divination played an enormous role in daily life. Before any important decision, whether political or personal, people sought to know the will of the gods. The most prestigious form of divination involved examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. Diviners, highly trained specialists, would slaughter a sheep, remove its liver, and examine it for irregularities. The liver was understood as a kind of message board where the gods wrote their intentions. Different marks, spots, or deformities in different parts of the liver meant different things, and complex manuals existed to help interpret them. Other forms of divination included observing the flight of birds, the behavior of animals, the patterns of smoke from incense, the way oil spread on water, and of course dreams. Dreams were particularly significant, understood as one of the primary ways gods communicated with humans. Dream interpretation manuals survive, listing hundreds of dream scenarios and their meanings. To dream of eating earth meant you would acquire property. To dream of seeing your own face in water meant you would have a second wife. To dream of climbing a mountain meant you would conquer your enemies. Festivals brought the entire community together in shared religious experience. These weren't solemn, quiet affairs like many modern religious services. They were explosions of activity, noise, color, and emotion. Musicians played loudly. People sang. Processions moved through the streets carrying divine statues on elaborate palanquins. Beer flowed freely, sanctified beer that had been offered to the gods and then distributed to the people. Special foods were prepared and shared. The New Year festival, celebrated in different ways in different cities but always significant, often lasted many days. In Babylon, it involved the ritual humiliation of the king, who was stripped of his regalia, slapped, and made to declare that he had not sinned against the city or the god. This ritual reaffirmed that the king served at divine pleasure, that he was accountable to powers greater than himself. After his humiliation, his insignia were restored, and he was reinvested with authority for another year. Sacred marriage rituals, enacted by the king and a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna, were believed to ensure the fertility of the land for the coming year. These weren't merely symbolic. The ritual involved actual sexual intercourse, understood as a reenactment of the sacred marriage between the goddess and the shepherd god Dumuzi. The fertility of the divine couple ensured the fertility of fields, flocks, and people. Women played more significant religious roles than they would in many later cultures. High priestesses held positions of real power, managing vast temple estates, performing essential rituals, and serving as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Some women served as naditu, consecrated women who lived in special quarters near temples, managing their own property and engaging in business while remaining devoted to religious service. The temple itself was far more than a place of worship. It functioned as the economic heart of the city. Temple lands might comprise a third or more of a city's agricultural territory. These lands were worked by temple dependents who received rations in return for their labor: grain, oil, wool, and occasionally meat. The temple served as a bank, lending seed grain to farmers and wealth to merchants. It manufactured goods in specialized workshops. textiles, metalwork, pottery, and luxury items. Massive granaries stored the grain collected from temple lands, providing both insurance against crop failure and a source of wealth that could be redistributed or traded. The temple archives, rooms filled with clay tablets, documented every transaction. These weren't spiritual documents but economic ones. Records of land holdings, lists of workers and their rations, accounts of goods received and distributed, loan contracts, debt acknowledgments. Some individuals served the temple in permanent roles, but many more had rotating obligations. A farmer might owe the temple 10 days of labor per year, working on canal maintenance or building projects. A craftsman might produce a certain number of items for the temple while also working independently. The system bound the entire economy to the religious institutions, making prosperity and piety inseparable. But life wasn't all ritual and labor. People fell in love, celebrated marriages, mourned deaths. They played music and games. They told stories. They worried about their children, argued with their neighbors, took pride in their work. They were human with human concerns, and their religion had to address these concerns or it wouldn't have lasted for thousands of years. Personal piety was valued. Hymns survived that expressed genuine devotion, real feeling of connection to the divine. One hymn to Inanna describes her as clothed with the heavens, crowned with the earth, as one who makes the house happy and brings prosperity. Another, addressed to Enlil, calls him the Father who makes barley and wheat grow, praising him for his life-giving powers. But there was also fear. The gods could be capricious. They could send disease, drought, invasion. A person might suffer despite having done nothing wrong, simply because the gods had decided it was so. This led to a sense of uncertainty, a recognition that human understanding was limited, that the divine will was often mysterious. One striking text, sometimes called the Babylonian Theodicy, deals directly with the problem of undeserved suffering. It's structured as a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend. The sufferer describes his many misfortunes despite his piety. I have prayed to the gods and made offerings, yet I am poor and despised. The wicked prosper while I suffer. His friend responds with conventional wisdom. Surely he has sinned somehow, perhaps unknowingly. But the sufferer insists on his innocence and questions divine justice. The text doesn't resolve the problem in any satisfying way. It concludes with a recognition that the gods' ways are mysterious, that human wisdom is insufficient to understand divine purposes. This isn't a happy answer, but it's an honest one, acknowledging the real difficulty of reconciling belief in divine justice with the evident unfairness of life. Another text, the Poem of the Righteous Sufferer, sometimes called the Babylonian Job, tells of Shub-Shemeshur-Shakin, a high official who falls from favor and suffers terrible illness despite his righteousness. He describes his symptoms in vivid detail: headaches, chest pain, difficulty breathing, fever. His family abandons him. His friends turn away. He prays desperately to Marduk, asking why he suffers. Eventually, after long suffering, Marduk sends healing dreams and the man recovers. But the text makes clear that the suffering wasn't punishment for sin. It was simply something that happened, perhaps a test, perhaps divine caprice. The man's restoration comes not from understanding why he suffered, but from patient endurance and continued faith despite incomprehensible pain. These texts reveal a sophisticated wrestling with fundamental questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the limits of understanding. The Mesopotamians didn't have simple, comfortable answers. They lived with uncertainty, with the knowledge that the gods were powerful but not always predictable, that doing the right things didn't guarantee good outcomes, that catastrophe could strike anyone. Yet they continued to serve the gods, to build temples, to perform rituals, to pray. Not from blind faith, but from recognition that the alternative, a universe without divine order, was even more terrifying. The Anunnaki, as the great gods who decreed fates, provided at least the hope that someone was in control, that events weren't purely random, that meaning existed even if humans couldn't always perceive it. In their homes, people kept small clay figurines representing their personal gods. These figurines, crude by the standards of temple statuary, were nonetheless cherished. They stood in household shrines, received small offerings of food and drink, and served as focal points for personal prayer. They were tangible reminders that even the humblest person had divine protection, that the gods, mighty as they were, could still care about individual human lives. Magic also played a role, though the line between religion and magic was blurry at best. Incantations existed for every purpose: protecting newborns, curing diseases, warding off demons, ensuring safe travel, gaining love, defeating enemies. These incantations often invoked the great gods, calling on their power to accomplish the desired end. The Anunnaki might be named in spells, their authority invoked to compel lesser spirits to obey. Amulets and talismans were common, worn around the neck or wrist, placed in homes or carried in pouches. These might be inscribed with protective symbols or short prayers. They functioned as portable divine presence, little pieces of sacred power that could defend against the dangers of an uncertain world. Death, when it came, was a transition but not necessarily a welcome one. The Mesopotamians had no concept of heaven as a reward for the righteous. Everyone, good and bad alike, went to the same place, the underworld, a dark, dusty realm where the dead existed as pale shadows of their former selves. The quality of one's afterlife depended not on moral virtue but on proper burial and on having living descendants who would pour libations and make offerings. Ghosts were real and could be dangerous. A person who died violently or who wasn't properly buried might return to trouble the living. Rituals existed to placate these unhappy spirits, to give them rest, to prevent them from causing harm. The dead were hungry and thirsty in the underworld, dependent on the living to provide them with sustenance through offerings. The Anunnaki, in their role as judges of the underworld, determined the fate of the dead. But this wasn't moral judgment in the Christian sense. They assigned places in the underworld hierarchy, roles in the land of the dead. A king might become a judge among the dead. A priest might serve the gods in the underworld as he had in life. But no one escaped death and no one achieved eternal bliss. This sobering view of death made life all the more precious. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll explore more deeply in the next section, contains a scene where the alewife Siduri advises Gilgamesh, who seeks immortality, "Fill your belly, day and night make merry, let days be full of joy, dance and make music day and night. These things alone are the concern of men." In other words, accept mortality, enjoy life while you have it, because death comes for everyone and the afterlife offers no compensation. This was the world the Anunnaki inhabited, not as distant, uncaring forces, but as active participants in an ongoing relationship with humanity. They were powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not omniscient, immortal but not perfect. They were the framework within which life made sense, the structure that supported meaning in a precarious existence. The clay tablets are silent now in museum cases, but once they spoke. They were read aloud in temples and palaces, in scribal schools where young students learned to write by copying the classics, in private homes where literate individuals entertained their families. The stories preserved on these tablets weren't just entertainment. They were sacred literature, moral instruction, philosophical exploration, and cultural memory all woven together. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as the masterpiece of Mesopotamian literature, the most complete and sophisticated narrative to survive from the ancient world. It exists in multiple versions, the earliest from the Sumerian period, the most complete from Assyria in the 7th century before the Common Era. The story centers on Gilgamesh, legendary king of Uruk, whose name appears in the Sumerian king list as one who ruled for 126 years, though this is clearly legendary rather than historical. The epic opens with a description of Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, perfect in form, mighty in strength, builder of Uruk's great wall. But his perfection makes him tyrannical. He oppresses his people, demands sexual rights over every bride on her wedding night, exhausts the young men with endless building projects. The people cry out to the gods for relief. The gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals, knowing nothing of civilization. Enkidu is hairy, powerful, and innocent. He runs with gazelles, drinks at watering holes with lions, knows neither bread nor beer. He protects the animals from hunters, destroying their traps and pits. A hunter, frustrated by Enkidu's interference, complains to his father, who advises him to go to Uruk and ask Gilgamesh for help. Gilgamesh sends a temple prostitute, Shamhat, to civilize Enkidu through sex. Shamhat finds Enkidu at a watering hole and offers herself to him. They make love for 6 days and 7 nights, and when Enkidu tries to return to the animals, they flee from him. The wild animals no longer recognize him as one of their own. He has become human through sexual experience. Shamhat clothes Enkidu, teaches him to eat bread and drink beer, anoints him with oil. She tells him about Gilgamesh and his oppression. Enkidu, now possessing human consciousness, travels to Uruk to challenge the king. He blocks Gilgamesh's path to a wedding, refusing to let the king exercise his privilege over the bride. They fight in the street, their combat shaking the doorposts and cracking walls. Gilgamesh wins, but barely. Impressed by Enkidu's strength, he proposes friendship instead of enmity. They embrace, becoming brothers in all but blood. Together, they plan adventures that will bring them glory. They travel to the cedar forest to kill its guardian, the monster Humbaba, whom Enlil appointed to protect the sacred trees. This is an act of hubris, of humans daring to challenge divine order. But they're young and confident and hungry for fame. After a fierce battle, they defeat Humbaba and cut down the cedar trees, taking the precious timber back to Uruk. The goddess Inanna, impressed by Gilgamesh's beauty and strength, proposes marriage. But Gilgamesh, in a stunning display of arrogance, refuses and insults her. He lists all her previous lovers and the terrible fates they suffered. Dumuzi, the shepherd, whose annual death she causes; Ishalanu, the gardener, whom she turned into a spider; a lion whom she gave to pitfalls; a horse whom she gave to whip and spur. "Would you treat me any better?" he asks. Inanna, enraged by this rejection, asks her father and to lend her the bull of heaven to punish Gilgamesh. She threatens to break open the gates of the underworld and release the dead if he refuses, and relents and gives her the bull. She sends it to ravage Uruk. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu, fighting together, kill the bull of heaven. Enkidu goes further, tearing off the bull's thigh and throwing it in Inanna's face. This is too much. The gods convene in council, and the Anunnaki appear in their judicial function. They decree that one of the heroes must die for these acts of sacrilege, killing Humbaba, guardian of the sacred forest, and killing the bull of heaven. They choose Enkidu. Enkidu falls ill. For 12 days he suffers, growing weaker. He has a vision of the underworld, describing it in terrible detail. A house of dust, where clay is the food and dirt is bread, where the residents wear feathers like birds and see no light, where all the great kings of the past sit in darkness. He curses the hunter who found him, curses Shamhat who civilized him, wishes he had remained an animal rather than experience this bitter end. But the sun god Shamash chides him. Would he really prefer to have never known bread and beer, fine clothes and the friendship of Gilgamesh? Enkidu reconsiders and changes his curse to a blessing. Then he dies. Gilgamesh mourns wildly, tearing his clothes, pulling his hair, weeping over his friend's body for 7 days and 7 nights, until a worm falls from Enkidu's nostril, proving the corpse has begun to decay. Enkidu's death transforms Gilgamesh. For the first time in his life he confronts mortality. If Enkidu could die, then he too must die. This realization terrifies him, drives him nearly mad. He refuses to accept it. Instead, he embarks on a desperate quest to find immortality. He travels to find Utnapishtim, the only human who ever gained eternal life. The journey takes him to the ends of the earth, through mountains guarded by scorpion people, along the road of the sun where darkness is absolute, to the garden of gems where trees bear jeweled fruit. Finally, he reaches the sea at the edge of the world. There he meets Siduri, the alewife, who tends a tavern at the edge of the waters. She tries to dissuade him from his quest, offering the advice about enjoying life that we mentioned before. But Gilgamesh insists. Siduri tells him to find Urshanabi, the ferryman who can cross the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim's island. Gilgamesh finds the ferryman and, in his impulsive way, destroys the sacred stones that make the crossing possible. Urshanabi must improvise, having Gilgamesh cut 300 poles to punt across the deadly waters without touching them. They make the crossing and Gilgamesh finally meets Utnapishtim. The meeting is disappointing. Utnapishtim looks like any ordinary man, not immortal, not special. Gilgamesh demands to know how he gained eternal life. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the Great Flood. This flood narrative, embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, likely served as one source for the biblical story of Noah. The gods, disturbed by human noise and overpopulation, decide to destroy humanity with a flood. A friend to humans warns Utnapishtim in a dream. He tells him to build a boat, to take aboard seeds of all living things, and to abandon his possessions. Utnapishtim obeys, building a massive boat and loading it with his family, craftsmen, animals, and seeds. The flood comes with terrible fury. Even the gods are terrified by what they've unleashed. The Anunnaki are specifically mentioned as raising torches that set the land ablaze as the storm approaches. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood rages. When it finally subsides, Utnapishtim sends out birds. First a dove, which finds nowhere to land and returns, then a swallow, which also returns, finally a raven, which doesn't come back. Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice on the mountaintop where his boat has grounded. The gods, who have been starving because humans weren't there to make offerings, gather around the sacrifice like flies. Inanna swears that she'll never forget the disaster, that she'll always remember it when she sees the lapis lazuli necklace around her neck. But Enlil arrives, furious that any humans survived. He intended total destruction. Ea chides him for his excessive cruelty, arguing that punishments should fit crimes, that a sinner should bear his own sin rather than all humanity being destroyed. Mollified, Enlil grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, taking them to live far away at the edge of the world. Utnapishtim finishes his story and tells Gilgamesh that his immortality was a unique circumstance, never to be repeated. The gods will not assemble again to grant such a gift. Gilgamesh has failed in his quest. As a consolation, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, ties stones to his feet to weigh himself down, retrieves the plant. He plans to take it back to Uruk and test it on an old man before using it himself. But on the return journey, while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant and steals it. The snake eats it and immediately sheds its skin, becoming young again. This is why snakes can renew themselves while humans cannot. Gilgamesh has lost his last chance at immortality. He returns to Uruk empty-handed. But something has changed. When he looks at the city walls, the massive fortifications he built, he sees them differently now. They will last beyond his lifetime. They are his immortality, his legacy, the mark he will leave on the world. He has accepted mortality and found meaning in mortal accomplishment. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, the limits of human power, and what makes life meaningful. The Anunnaki appear in it not as central characters but as background presence. The divine council that decrees Enkidu's death, the gods who raise torches as the flood approaches. They are the structure of divine authority against which human drama plays out. Another important text featuring the Anunnaki is Inanna's descent to the underworld. This Sumerian myth tells of the goddess Inanna's decision to visit the underworld, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. Inanna adorns herself with all her divine power, the crown of the steppe, the measuring rod and line, the lapis lazuli necklace, the breastplate, the gold ring, and the royal robe. These items are not merely ornaments but sources of her divine authority, the me that make her who she is. She travels to the underworld and demands entry. The gatekeeper, following Ereshkigal's instructions, allows her to enter but extracts a price at each of the 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna must remove one of her divine garments or implements. By the time she reaches the throne room, she arrives naked and powerless, stripped of all that made her divine. The 7 Anunnaki judges of the underworld look at her with the look of death. Ereshkigal strikes her dead and hangs her corpse on a hook. 3 days and 3 nights pass. In the world above, all sexual activity ceases. Nothing mates or reproduces. Life itself begins to fail. Inanna's minister, Ninshubur, following instructions Inanna gave before descending, goes to the gods for help. Enlil refuses. Nanna refuses. Finally, Enki agrees to help. He creates 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures neither alive nor dead, who can enter the underworld without being subject to its laws. These beings descend, find Ereshkigal moaning in pain from the pangs of childbirth. They sympathize with her pain and grateful for their sympathy, she offers them a gift. They ask for Inanna's corpse. Ereshkigal grants it to them. They sprinkle Inanna's body with the food of life and the water of life that Enki provided, and she revives. But there's a law of the underworld. No one can leave without providing a substitute. Demons accompany Inanna back to the world to ensure someone takes her place. She finds her husband, Dumuzi, sitting on her throne in fine clothes, not mourning her absence. Enraged, she decrees that he will be her substitute. Dumuzi flees, seeking help from the sun god. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld, and his sister Jeshtinanna will spend the other half. This alternation explains the seasons. When Dumuzi is in the underworld, the earth is barren and Inanna mourns. When he returns, life renews and the earth blooms. This myth addresses many themes: the power of death, the limits of divine authority, the grief of loss, the cycle of seasons, and the price of resurrection. The Anunnaki appear as judges, as the arbiters of death, emphasizing their role in maintaining cosmic order even in the darkest realm. These stories weren't mere entertainment. They were performed in temples during festivals, teaching moral lessons and explaining natural phenomena. They showed that even the gods faced limits, that death was universal, that life was precious precisely because it was finite. They gave narrative form to the anxieties and hopes of Mesopotamian culture. Other texts elaborate on different aspects of the gods' activities. The Atrahasis epic, another flood story, explains that humans were created because the lesser gods complained about their labor. They go on strike, surrounding Enlil's house and demanding relief. The solution is to create humans to do the work instead. This text provides more detail than Gilgamesh about the creation of humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, the rebellion that led to the flood, and the compromise that allowed humanity to survive. The Enuma Elish, which we discussed earlier, was as much political propaganda as religious text. It justified Babylon's supremacy by showing how Marduk, Babylon's patron god, saved the other gods and became their king. The text's annual recitation during the New Year festival reinforced Babylon's claim to leadership over all Mesopotamia. Hymns and prayers provide a different perspective on the Anunnaki. These texts show personal devotion, individual relationship with the gods. One hymn to Enlil praises him as the father who makes barley and wheat grow, the one whose command is supreme, whose word cannot be altered. Another prayer describes how when Enlil frowns, the gods scatter in fear, but when he smiles, prosperity flows like water. These literary works weren't academic exercises. They shaped how Mesopotamians understood reality, provided frameworks for making sense of suffering and joy, explained the inexplicable, and connected individual lives to cosmic drama. The Anunnaki appear throughout as the framework of divine authority, the structure within which all these stories make sense. Time doesn't stand still, not for empires, not for cities, and not for gods. The religious landscape of Mesopotamia evolved over thousands of years, shaped by political changes, military conquests, cultural exchanges, and the constant human need to make sense of changing circumstances. The Anunnaki, while remaining conceptually important, underwent transformations in how they were understood and which specific deities were included in their number. In the earliest Sumerian period, the pantheon was decentralized. Each city had its patron deity who owned the city and its lands. Uruk belonged to Nana. Uar belonged to Nana, the moon god. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Eridu, considered the oldest city, belonged to Enki. These gods were supreme within their territories but didn't necessarily have universal authority. The Anunnaki, as children of An, formed the aristocracy of heaven. But their relationships, their relative powers, and even their roles could vary depending on which city's traditions you followed. In Nippur, Enlil was clearly supreme among the Anunnaki, the king of gods whose word was law. In Eridu, texts emphasized Enki's wisdom and his role as creator and protector of humanity. In Uruk, Inanna's power and passion dominated religious narratives. This decentralization made sense in a political landscape of independent city-states that sometimes cooperated, sometimes warred, but rarely submitted to central authority for long. Each city's patron god was analogous to its king, and just as cities competed for supremacy, so did their gods in myth. The rise of empire changed this. When Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states around 2,300 years before the Common Era, creating the first multi-ethnic empire in history, religious synthesis became politically necessary. The Akkadians were Semitic speakers, different from the Sumerians in language and origin. But they adopted Sumerian religion wholesale, translating Sumerian names into Akkadian equivalents, and became Anu. Enlil remained Enlil but took on Akkadian epithets and roles. Enki became Ea. Inanna became Ishtar. The myths were retold with Akkadian linguistic flavor but retained their Sumerian structures. The Anunnaki continued as the great gods, but now they represented a synthesis of two cultures, a divine bureaucracy that mirrored the multi-ethnic empire below. The Old Babylonian period, around 2,000 years before the Common Era, saw further changes. Babylon, originally an insignificant town, rose to prominence under Hammurabi, one of the great lawgivers of antiquity. Hammurabi's law code, carved on a massive stone stele, invoked the authority of the gods to justify his regulations. At the top of the stele, a carving shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. But Babylon's patron god was Marduk, originally a relatively minor deity associated with agriculture and magic. As Babylon's political power grew, so did Marduk's divine status. The composition of the Enuma Elish served partly to justify Marduk's elevation. In this epic, as we saw earlier, Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the universe, earning supremacy over all other gods through his mighty deeds. This wasn't historical truth in any literal sense. It was political theology explaining why Babylon deserved to rule and why Marduk deserved to be king of gods. Other cities had their own versions of cosmic events that emphasized their own gods' importance. Religious narratives served political purposes, legitimizing power structures through divine precedent. The Assyrians, who dominated northern Mesopotamia and eventually conquered most of the Near East, similarly elevated their patron god Ashur. In Assyrian versions of creation myths, Ashur sometimes takes the place of Marduk or Enlil as supreme deity. Royal inscriptions described Assyrian kings as chosen by Ashur to rule, as instruments of divine will bringing order to chaos. Throughout these political and religious shifts, the concept of the Anunnaki persisted but evolved. In later periods, they became increasingly associated with the underworld and with judicial functions. Less emphasis was placed on individual members of the group, more on their collective role as judges and maintainers of cosmic order. This evolution reflected changing political realities. As empires centralized power, as royal authority became more absolute, the divine realm came to mirror earthly hierarchy more closely. The Anunnaki became more like a divine senate or supreme court, assembled to ratify the decisions of the supreme god rather than to debate and decide independently. Regional variations remained significant. In the far south, in the marshlands where Sumerian culture persisted longest, older traditions maintained their grip. In the north, Assyrian religious practices emphasized military might and royal power. In Babylon, learning and scholarship flourished, and the religious texts became more elaborate and philosophically sophisticated. Scribes in different cities copied and recopied the ancient texts, but they sometimes added their own commentaries or created new versions that reflected local traditions. A myth known from Nippur might exist in a different version from Babylon, with different emphits, different details, sometimes even different outcomes. These weren't contradictions in the way we might think of contradictions today. They were variations on themes, different perspectives on shared cultural heritage. The practice of syncretism, identifying gods from different traditions with each other, became common. When the Kassites ruled Babylon, they brought their own gods but identified them with Babylonian deities. When the Persians conquered Mesopotamia in 539 before the Common Era, they allowed local religious practices to continue while also promoting their own Zoroastrian faith. Gods of similar function from different cultures were often equated. This weather god equals that weather god, this love goddess equals that love goddess. Through all these changes, Mesopotamian religion showed remarkable continuity. Temples continued to function. Rituals continued to be performed. The old myths continued to be told, even as new layers of meaning accrued to them. The Anunnaki remained conceptually important, even as specific understandings of who they were and what they did evolved. One significant development in later periods was the increased emphasis on personal piety and individual relationship with the divine. Earlier texts focused heavily on the king as intermediary between humans and gods, on the city as the unit of religious organization. Later texts show more concern with individual moral behavior, with personal prayers and devotional practices. This shift wasn't complete or universal, but it's visible in the literature. Penitential psalms appear, where individuals confess sins they may not even be aware of committing, begging forgiveness from personal gods who have apparently withdrawn their protection. Wisdom literature proliferates, offering advice on how to live a good life that pleases the gods. The Anunnaki in these contexts become more abstract, more concerned with moral order than with the specific fertility of fields or victory in battle. They judge not just cities and kings but individuals. They maintain not just cosmic order but moral law. This evolution reflects broader changes in Mesopotamian society, increasing urbanization, more complex social structures, and perhaps a growing sense of individual identity distinct from family or city. Mathematical and astronomical advances also affected religious thought. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated mathematical systems using base 60, which allowed them to calculate lunar and eclipse cycles with remarkable precision. They could predict astronomical phenomena years in advance, which must have seemed like divine knowledge to those who didn't understand the calculations. Babylonian astronomers became very skilled at mathematics and could accurately predict eclipses and solstices. This knowledge was closely guarded by the priestly class, who used it to interpret divine will. If you could predict when an eclipse would occur, you could prepare rituals to ward off its evil influence. If you could calculate when the seasons would change, you could advise the king on when to plant and harvest, when to go to war, when to make peace. Chaldean astronomers discovered that lunar eclipses followed a 19-year cycle, a finding that required meticulous observation over decades. They charted the paths of planets, noting their movements with precision that wouldn't be surpassed until the invention of the telescope. They created star catalogs, mapping the night sky into constellations that we still recognize today. All of this astronomical work was intimately connected to religion. The gods were associated with celestial bodies. Shamash was the sun. Sin was the moon. Ishtar was Venus. The movements of these celestial bodies were understood as the movements of the gods themselves, and therefore as messages about divine intentions. Divination through astronomical observation became a sophisticated practice, with elaborate manuals detailing what various celestial phenomena meant. The Enuma, Anu and Lil, a massive compendium of astronomical omens, contained thousands of predictions based on celestial observations. It was organized systematically, covering lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, planetary movements, weather phenomena, and earthquakes. Each observation was paired with a prediction. If on the 14th day an eclipse occurs, the king will die and his son will take the throne. If Venus appears in the east in the month of Nisan, there will be good harvest. These weren't superstitions to the Mesopotamians but practical knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of careful observation. The fact that eclipses could be predicted suggested that the future itself could be known, that the gods had already decided what would happen and had written their decisions in the movements of the heavens. This determinist strand in Mesopotamian thought coexisted with the belief that proper ritual could avert predicted disasters. If an omen predicted the king's death, substitute rituals could be performed. A commoner might be dressed as king, seated on the throne for a brief period, then executed. The omen would be fulfilled on the substitute, protecting the real king. This practice, attested in historical records, shows how seriously the Mesopotamians took their divination. The Anunnaki, as deciders of fate, were understood to be behind these celestial messages. When they assembled in council to decree someone's fate, the decision was written in the stars. The astronomer priests who could read these signs were therefore reading the Anunnaki's decrees, gaining foreknowledge of divine decisions. In the Persian period, after Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, Mesopotamian religion entered a new phase. The Persians were Zoroastrians, worshipping Ahura Mazda as supreme deity. But they were also remarkably tolerant of local religions. Cyrus famously allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. He also patronized Babylonian temples, participating in the New Year festival and taking the hands of Marduk's statue in the traditional ritual that legitimized kingship. This religious pluralism allowed Mesopotamian traditions to continue even as they came under new influences. Zoroastrian ideas about cosmic dualism, the battle between good and evil, may have influenced later Mesopotamian theology. Trade and cultural exchange brought Indian, Greek, and Egyptian ideas into contact with Mesopotamian thought, creating new syntheses. By the Seleucid period, after Alexander the Great's conquests brought Mesopotamia under Greek control, the region had become incredibly cosmopolitan. Greek philosophers studied in Babylon. Babylonian astronomers contributed to Greek astronomical knowledge. The god lists became even more elaborate, as Greek gods were identified with Mesopotamian ones. Zeus equaled Bel, a title of Marduk. Aphrodite equaled Ishtar. Apollo equaled Shamash. Through all these changes, clay tablets continued to be written in cuneiform, preserving ancient knowledge and creating new texts. The latest known cuneiform tablet, an astronomical text, dates to 75 of the Common Era. By then, Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire. Judaism had developed into a mature monotheistic religion. The old gods of Mesopotamia were fading, their temples falling into disrepair, their rituals performed by dwindling congregations. But they didn't disappear immediately or completely. Into the early centuries of the Common Era, Mesopotamian religious traditions persisted in some areas. The Mandeans, a Gnostic sect that still exists today in small numbers, preserve practices and beliefs that may reach back to ancient Mesopotamian religion. The Yazidis of northern Iraq, while their religion is quite distinct, may also preserve fragments of pre-Islamic Mesopotamian beliefs. More broadly, Mesopotamian religious ideas influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The flood narrative appears in Genesis, adapted from Mesopotamian originals. The concept of fallen angels may owe something to Mesopotamian demons. Architectural forms like the ziggurat may have influenced the Tower of Babel story. The 7-day week, the division of the day into 24 hours, the sexagesimal system still used for measuring angles and time, all come from Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki as a specific group of deities faded from worship and memory. But the ideas they represented, the sense of divine hierarchy, of gods who judge and decree fates, of cosmic order maintained by divine will, these ideas persisted and transformed into later religious systems. The year was 1976. In bookstores across America, a new title appeared, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. The cover promised revelations about humanity's alien ancestry. The text within claimed that ancient Sumerian texts, when properly translated, revealed the truth. Humanity was created by extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaki who came from a planet called Nibiru. This wasn't scholarship. This was science fiction presented as fact, fantasy dressed in the costume of archaeology. But it was enormously successful, spawning 13 more books, countless imitators, television documentaries, and a cottage industry of ancient astronaut theorists who continue to this day to proclaim that the gods were aliens. Sitchin's basic narrative went like this. A planet called Nibiru, supposedly the 12th planet of our solar system, counting the sun and moon as planets, which modern astronomy doesn't, orbits far beyond Pluto on an extremely elliptical path that brings it into the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. This planet is inhabited by advanced beings called the Anunnaki. Around 450,000 years ago, according to Sitchin, the Anunnaki came to Earth seeking gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They established mining operations, initially working the mines themselves. But the work was hard, and the Anunnaki workers eventually rebelled against their leaders, demanding relief. The solution, Sitchin claimed, was to create primitive workers who could do the mining instead. The Anunnaki geneticists, led by the scientist Enki, took the existing hominids on Earth and genetically engineered them, mixing Anunnaki DNA with primitive human DNA to create Homo sapiens. Humans were thus a hybrid species, created to be slaves in the gold mines. This narrative continued through a whole succession of events supposedly recorded in Sumerian texts. Conflicts between different Anunnaki factions, genetic experiments creating various human subspecies, Anunnaki males mating with human females to produce demigod offspring, and eventually a decision to destroy humanity with a global flood because humans had become too numerous and troublesome. Only one human, Utnapishtim or Noah in the biblical version, was saved because the Anunnaki scientist Enki, who had always been sympathetic to humans, warned him to build a boat. After the flood, the Anunnaki decided to allow humanity to continue but left Earth, promising to return when Nibiru's orbit brought them close again. This is the narrative that has captured millions of imaginations. It appears in documentaries on the History Channel and Travel Channel. It's cited by conspiracy theorists as proof that established archaeology is hiding the truth. It's become so pervasive that many people genuinely believe it represents authentic ancient knowledge recovered from Sumerian texts. There's just one problem: none of it is true. Not the translation of the texts, not the astronomical claims, not the genetic engineering narrative, none of it. Sitchin's work is a masterpiece of pseudo-archaeology, mixing just enough real information to sound plausible while systematically misrepresenting or inventing the rest. Let's start with the planet Nibiru. No such planet exists in our solar system. Modern astronomy has thoroughly mapped the outer solar system. While it's possible that a large planet exists far beyond Pluto, the hypothetical planet 9 that some astronomers are searching for, no planet follows the orbital path Sitchin described. Such an orbit would be gravitationally unstable and would have been detected long ago through its effects on other planets. More fundamentally, ancient Mesopotamian texts don't describe any such planet. The word Nibiru does appear in ancient texts, but it refers to a celestial body, likely Jupiter, not to a 12th planet on an elliptical orbit. In the Enuma Elish, Nibiru is mentioned as Marduk's celestial station, the point where he crosses the ecliptic. It's an astronomical reference point, not a planet. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts were, to put it charitably, creative. He claimed to be a scholar of ancient languages, but professional Assyriologists have thoroughly debunked his translations. He misread signs, invented meanings that don't exist in any dictionary, ignored grammatical rules, and cherry-picked passages while ignoring context. For example, Sitchin claimed that the Sumerian word for create actually meant genetic engineering. This is false. The word means create, as in make or fashion, and is used throughout ancient texts to describe gods making things, from the cosmos to cities to tools. There's nothing about DNA splicing or genetic manipulation. Similarly, Sitchin claimed that ancient depictions of the Sumerian tree of life actually showed the structure of DNA. This requires ignoring what the texts say about these symbols and imposing modern scientific imagery onto ancient religious art. The tree of life in Mesopotamian art was a religious symbol, often associated with the goddess Inanna, representing fertility and abundance. It looked nothing like the modern double helix model of DNA. Sitchin's claims about gold mining are equally baseless. Yes, ancient Mesopotamians valued gold and used it in jewelry and religious artifacts. But there's no evidence of large-scale gold mining in ancient Mesopotamia. Most gold was imported through trade, as Mesopotamia lacks significant gold deposits. The idea that the Anunnaki created humans to mine gold appears nowhere in any ancient text. The actual Mesopotamian creation myths, which we've already explored, describe humans being created to serve the gods by farming, building temples, and preparing offerings. The gods needed laborers not for mining but for agriculture and cult maintenance. This makes perfect sense in the context of Mesopotamian civilization, which was based on intensive agriculture and elaborate temple economies. Sitchin's misrepresentation of the flood narrative is particularly egregious. The ancient flood story, as preserved in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, doesn't describe aliens deciding to destroy humanity. It describes gods disturbed by human noise and overpopulation, voting to send a flood, then regretting their decision when they realize the horror of what they've done. There's no genetic engineering, no space travel, no advanced technology. There are gods who behave like the gods of any ancient pantheon. Powerful but flawed, capable of mistakes, swayed by emotion, disagreeing among themselves. The hero Utnapishtim survives not because friendly aliens warned him but because the god Ea, who loved humanity, whispered a warning through the walls of his reed house. But why did Sitchin's ideas gain such traction? Why do millions of people believe this narrative despite its complete lack of evidentiary support? Several factors contributed to this success. First, the books were published at a time of widespread interest in UFOs and aliens. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw intense public fascination with extraterrestrial life. The success of films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. reflected and amplified this interest. Sitchin's books offered a grand narrative that connected ancient history with UFO speculation. Second, the narrative flattered its audience by suggesting they had access to hidden knowledge that mainstream scholars either didn't understand or were deliberately suppressing. This is a common feature of conspiracy theories and pseudo-archaeology. You're not ignorant for believing nonsense. You're enlightened, seeing truths that others can't or won't acknowledge. Third, the books arrived when public trust in institutions was declining. The Watergate scandal had just revealed high-level government corruption. The Vietnam War had demonstrated that official narratives could be false. In this climate, claims that mainstream archaeologists were wrong or lying found ready audiences. Fourth, Sitchin's narrative provided seemingly simple answers to complex questions. Where did we come from? Aliens. Why did civilization develop so quickly? Aliens taught us. How did ancient peoples build impressive structures? Aliens helped them. These answers require no wrestling with nuance, no acceptance of uncertainty, no acknowledgement that ancient peoples were capable of remarkable achievements without extraterrestrial assistance. Fifth, and perhaps most insidiously, the ancient astronaut narrative implicitly denigrates the achievements of ancient peoples. It suggests that humans couldn't possibly have developed agriculture, mathematics, writing, and monumental architecture on their own. We needed alien intervention. This particularly affects how people view non-European ancient civilizations. It's no coincidence that ancient astronaut theories most often target the achievements of Egyptians, Mesoamericans, and Mesopotamians rather than Greeks or Romans. The underlying racism in these theories becomes clear when you examine their logic. Why assume that pyramids required alien intervention? Because we can't imagine how ancient Egyptians without modern technology could have built them. But this failure of imagination says more about us than about ancient Egyptians. Archaeological evidence clearly shows how pyramids were built. With enormous labor forces, sophisticated organizational systems, clever use of simple machines, and accumulated engineering knowledge passed down through generations. The same applies to Mesopotamian ziggurats, to the megalithic structures of South America, to stone circles in Britain. All of these represent human ingenuity, human effort, human achievement. To attribute them to aliens is to rob ancient peoples of credit for their own accomplishments. Sitchin wasn't the first to propose ancient astronaut theories. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, various writers suggested that myths of gods descending from heaven actually described space travelers. But Sitchin systematized these ideas, gave them a pseudo-scholarly framework, and connected them specifically to Mesopotamian civilization. His books cited actual ancient texts, displayed photographs of actual artifacts, and presented themselves as serious archaeological research. This veneer of scholarship made them more persuasive than earlier, more obviously speculative works. Many readers, not equipped to evaluate Sumerian translation or verify astronomical claims, took Sitchin at his word. The spread of the internet amplified these ideas enormously. Websites dedicated to ancient astronaut theories proliferated. Forums allowed believers to share evidence and reinforce each other's beliefs. YouTube provided a platform for countless videos presenting Sitchin's ideas as fact. Social media algorithms, designed to show people content similar to what they've already engaged with, created echo chambers where pseudo-archaeology flourished. Television networks, particularly those focused on educational content, began producing documentaries based on ancient astronaut theories. Ancient Aliens, which has run for numerous seasons, presents Sitchin's ideas and similar theories with impressive production values and serious-sounding narration. The use of actual archaeologists and historical sites lends credibility, even though the interpretations presented are rejected by mainstream archaeology. The commercial success of this material created perverse incentives. Publishers wanted more books like Sitchin's because they sold well. Television producers wanted more shows like Ancient Aliens because they attracted viewers. The market rewarded sensationalism over accuracy, speculation over scholarship. Academic archaeologists and historians found themselves in a difficult position. Engaging with pseudo-archaeology risked giving it credibility through attention. Ignoring it allowed false narratives to spread unchallenged. Many chose to focus on their academic work, writing peer-reviewed articles and technical monographs that reached fellow scholars but not the general public. This created a gap. While serious archaeologists published in academic journals, pseudo-archaeologists published popular books and appeared on television. The result was that many people's only exposure to ancient Mesopotamia came through lenses distorted by ancient astronaut theories. The situation was complicated by the fact that some of Sitchin's followers were genuinely curious about the ancient world. They read his books not from a desire to believe nonsense but from fascination with history. When academic archaeologists dismissed them as cranks rather than engaging with their questions, it reinforced the narrative that mainstream scholars were closed-minded or hiding something. A few academic authors did attempt to bridge this gap, writing accessible books about ancient Mesopotamia for general audiences. But these struggled to compete with the more sensational claims of ancient astronaut theorists. A book explaining that the Anunnaki were gods in an ancient pantheon can't match the excitement of a book claiming they were alien genetic engineers. The damage done by these misrepresentations is significant. An entire generation has grown up with distorted ideas about ancient Mesopotamia. Many people's first exposure to Sumerian mythology comes through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. When they eventually encounter accurate information, it can seem less interesting or even like a cover-up. More broadly, the success of ancient astronaut theories represents a failure of science communication and education. If people found Sitchin's books more compelling than actual archaeology, it suggests that archaeology wasn't doing enough to make its findings accessible and engaging. The fault lies not with the public for being curious but with institutions for not meeting that curiosity with good information. In recent years, more archaeologists and historians have made efforts to combat pseudo-archaeology directly. Blogs, podcasts, and YouTube channels run by actual experts now provide accessible, accurate information about ancient civilizations. Some scholars have written books specifically debunking ancient astronaut claims, going through Sitchin's arguments point by point to show where and how he went wrong. These efforts are bearing fruit. More people are encountering authentic archaeological information. But the battle is ongoing, and the ancient astronaut narrative continues to reach millions through television and the internet. Understanding how this happened, how a completely fabricated narrative about the Anunnaki gained such widespread acceptance, is crucial to understanding both the power and the vulnerability of historical knowledge. It shows how easily truth can be obscured when fiction is more entertaining, how willing people are to believe claims that flatter their sense of having special knowledge, and how important it is for scholars to engage with public audiences rather than retreating into academic isolation. The library at Johns Hopkins University houses thousands of cuneiform tablets. On any given day you might find Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Near Eastern languages, sitting at a table with a magnifying glass, carefully examining the wedge-shaped impressions in clay that are 4,000 years old. Each sign must be identified correctly. Each word must be translated accurately. The grammar must be understood in its proper context. This is real scholarship, painstaking and precise. It requires years of training to read ancient languages, deep knowledge of historical context, and intellectual honesty that prioritizes accuracy over exciting conclusions. When scholars like Dr. Heiser and many others examine Sitchin's work, they find errors on virtually every page. Let's look at specific examples of how Sitchin's translations go wrong and what the texts actually say. Sitchin claimed that the Sumerian word dan.jer means righteous ones of the rocket ships. The actual meaning is simply God or gods. It's the most common word for deity in Sumerian, appearing thousands of times in texts spanning millennia. There is no component of this word that means rocket, or ship, or anything related to space travel. The sign Din means divine or godlike. The sign Gir is a determinative, a sign that doesn't represent a sound but classifies the word. Together, they form the standard way of writing God, in Sumerian. To read this as righteous ones of the rocket ships requires ignoring every dictionary, every grammar, and every occurrence of the word in actual ancient texts. Sitchin claimed that the Sumerian term, unna.ki, means those who from heaven came to earth. Let's break down what it actually means. En does mean heaven or sky and is also the name of the sky god. Yunin relates to princely or of royal blood, derived from Inuen, which means prince or lord. Ki means earth or land, but in this context, it's a grammatical marker indicating plurality or a group. The actual meaning is princely offspring, or those of royal blood, referring to the children of En, the sky god. It's a designation of divine status, not of extraterrestrial origin. Every legitimate scholar of Sumerian agrees on this translation. Sitchin simply made up his version to fit his narrative. Consider the term Mi, which appears frequently in Sumerian texts. These are the divine decrees or powers that govern existence. Sitchin claimed Mi referred to advanced technological devices, perhaps computers or data storage systems. In reality, Mi refers to abstract concepts and divine powers: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, sexual intercourse, descent into the underworld, music, metalworking, and hundreds of other aspects of existence. The famous story of Inanna's journey to Eridu describes her getting the god Enki drunk and stealing his Mi, taking them back to her city of Uruk. Sitchin interpreted this as her stealing advanced alien technology. The actual story is about the goddess acquiring divine powers and knowledge, transferring them from an old religious center to a new one. It's a mythological explanation for why Uruk became powerful and culturally dominant. Sitchin's misrepresentation of the creation of humanity is particularly problematic. He claimed that Mesopotamian texts describe genetic engineering, mixing Anunnaki DNA with primitive human DNA. Let's look at what the texts actually say. The Atrahasis epic describes the creation of humanity thus: the lesser gods were laboring, digging irrigation canals, clearing rivers, tasks that the Anunnaki imposed on them. The work was hard and they complained for 40 years. Finally they rebelled, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's house, demanding relief. Enlil wanted to slaughter the rebels, but Enki proposed a different solution: create humans to do the work instead. Enki instructed that a god be slaughtered and his flesh and blood mixed with clay. The mother goddess Bilaili, another name for Ninhursag, would mix the clay and divine flesh, and from this mixture humans would be created. This is clearly mythological. There's no DNA, no genetic engineering, no scientific process. It's a religious explanation for human existence that follows the pattern of many creation myths. Humans are formed from earth, clay, and given life through divine essence, the blood of a god. The purpose is to serve the gods, which in Mesopotamian context meant maintaining temples and agricultural lands. Sitchin claimed that descriptions of the flood in Mesopotamian text showed aliens trying to destroy humanity. The actual texts show nothing of the sort. In the Atrahasis version, the gods decide to send a flood because humanity has become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. This isn't aliens worried about an out-of-control experiment. It's an explanation for natural disasters that emphasizes the gods' power over nature and humanity's precarious existence. Enki's role in warning Utnapishtim, called Atrahasis in this version, isn't a friendly alien helping humans. It's a god who valued his creation acting to preserve it, even against the will of other gods. The story shows divine conflict, divine regret, and ultimately divine decision to allow humanity to continue, but with measures to limit population growth, death, infertility, celibate priestesses, demons who kill infants. The scholarly consensus on all of this is overwhelming. Professional Assyriologists, people who have devoted their careers to studying ancient Mesopotamian languages and texts, unanimously reject Sitchin's translations. Organizations like the American Schools of Oriental Research and the International Association for Assyriology have published critiques explaining in detail why Sitchin's work is not credible scholarship. Dr. Michael Heiser, mentioned earlier, wrote a detailed article titled, "The Myth of a Twelfth Planet," available freely online, going through Sitchin's claims point by point. He shows that Sitchin regularly misidentifies cuneiform signs, ignores standard grammatical rules, and invents translations that appear in no legitimate dictionary. Other scholars have noted that Sitchin often cites texts correctly but then provides interpretations that bear no relation to what the texts actually say. He might quote a passage describing Enlil as Lord of the Air, and then claim this proves Enlil commanded aircraft. But Lord of the Air is a standard divine epithet referring to Enlil's control over weather and atmosphere, not to airplanes or spacecraft. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides another example. Sitchin claimed that Gilgamesh's journey to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba was actually a mission to destroy a spaceport. The text describes Humbaba as a monster appointed by Enlil to guard the sacred cedar forest. The cedars were valuable for timber, used in temple construction. The story is about heroes seeking glory by defeating a powerful guardian and acquiring valuable resources. There is no spaceport, no advanced technology, just a mythological adventure tale. Sitchin pointed to ancient artwork showing beings with wings or wearing unusual clothing and claimed these depicted aliens in space suits. Scholars identify these figures as mythological beings, protective spirits, gods, or mythical heroes. The wings are conventional artistic symbols of divinity or supernatural power, common across many ancient cultures. The helmets Sitchin saw are actually horned crowns, standard symbols of divinity in Mesopotamian art. The famous Sumerian king list, which records the reigns of Sumerian kings before and after the flood, gives some kings reigns of thousands or tens of thousands of years. Sitchin claimed this proved these were actually alien Anunnaki with extended lifespans. Scholars understand these numbers as mythological, similar to the extremely long lifespans given to biblical patriarchs in Genesis. They serve to establish the antiquity and divine legitimacy of kingship, not to record actual historical reign lengths. After the flood and the king list, the reign lengths become much more plausible, eventually settling into historically verifiable numbers that match other records. This transition from mythological to historical time is a common pattern in ancient literature, marking the boundary between sacred past and recorded history. Sitchin's astronomical claims have been thoroughly debunked by professional astronomers. No planet Nibiru exists. No celestial body follows the orbit he described. The ancient astronomical texts he cited don't describe any such planet. When Sitchin pointed to ancient cylinder seals showing what he claimed was a depiction of the solar system with a 12th planet, scholars showed that these seals actually depicted standard Mesopotamian religious symbolism: gods, stars, and religious symbols, not planetary diagrams. One seal in particular, which Sitchin called the Earth Seal, and claimed showed all the planets including Nibiru, has been thoroughly analyzed by experts. The objects Sitchin identified as planets are actually stars, which is indicated by the number of points they have. In Mesopotamian iconography, stars were drawn with specific numbers of points to indicate different celestial objects. What Sitchin interpreted as a solar system model was actually a religious scene showing a god surrounded by stars. The mathematical arguments against Nibiru are also conclusive. A planet with the orbit Sitchin described would have created observable gravitational effects on other planets. Its approach to the inner solar system would have been detected by astronomers decades ago through its influence on cometary orbits and planetary positions. No such effects have ever been observed. Furthermore, if Nibiru approaches Earth every 3,600 years, we should see evidence of its effects in the historical and geological record. Sitchin claimed the last approach was around 3,600 years ago, around 1600 before the Common Era. But there's no evidence of any unusual celestial events or global catastrophes at that time. Civilizations around the world continued normally, keeping records that mention nothing unusual in the sky. The biological arguments against Sitchin's genetic engineering claims are equally strong. Modern genetics has revealed that humans share common ancestry with other primates, with a clear evolutionary path documented through fossil evidence and genetic analysis. There's no mysterious gap in human evolution that requires alien intervention to explain. The development of modern humans from earlier hominids is well documented and entirely consistent with evolutionary processes. Moreover, the idea of aliens mixing their DNA with ours to create humans makes no biological sense. DNA from extraterrestrial life, if it exists, would have evolved completely independently and would not be compatible with Earth life. The genetic code itself might be different. The molecular machinery of cells would be different. You couldn't just mix alien and human DNA and get a viable hybrid any more than you could mix human DNA with plant DNA and get a hybrid. Sitchin's claim that the Anunnaki needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere is scientifically nonsensical. Gold is chemically inert, which is why it doesn't corrode or tarnish. This same property makes it useless for any kind of atmospheric modification. You can't use gold to repair an atmosphere. The premise of Sitchin's entire narrative is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of chemistry and planetary science. The anthropological evidence also contradicts Sitchin's timeline. He claimed the Anunnaki created modern humans around 300,000 years ago. But archaeological evidence shows that anatomically modern humans existed as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years before the development of agriculture and civilization. If aliens created us as miners or agricultural workers, why did we spend most of our existence as our species hunting and gathering? The development of agriculture, which occurred independently in multiple regions around the world starting about 12,000 years ago, is well documented through archaeological evidence. We can trace the domestication of various crops and animals, see how farming techniques developed gradually, observe how settlements grew and evolved into cities. There's no need to invoke alien intervention. Human ingenuity, driven by climate change at the end of the Ice Age and population pressures, adequately explains the agricultural revolution. The rise of civilization in Mesopotamia follows a clear trajectory visible in the archaeological record. We can see the development from small farming villages to larger settlements to true cities. We can track the invention of pottery, the development of irrigation systems, the emergence of specialized crafts, the invention of writing. Each development builds logically on previous ones. There are no sudden, inexplicable leaps that would suggest outside intervention. The archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia itself is particularly damning for Sitchin's theories. Thousands of texts have been translated and published. None of them describe space travel, genetic engineering, or any of the other technological marvels Sitchin claimed to find in them. If the ancient astronaut narrative were true, we would expect to find clear descriptions of these technologies. Instead, we find exactly what we'd expect from an ancient civilization: myths, prayers, legal codes, business records, astronomical observations, medical texts, and literary works. The consistency of Mesopotamian texts across millennia also argues against Sitchin's interpretations. If the Anunnaki were aliens who left Earth, we would expect texts to show nostalgia for their departure, predictions of their return, or traditions about their otherworldly origin. Instead, the texts consistently portray the Anunnaki as gods who are always present, always active in the world, exactly as we'd expect if they were religious concepts rather than historical aliens. The iconography of Mesopotamian art provides further evidence. Thousands of cylinder seals, statues, reliefs, and paintings survive. They show consistent artistic conventions for depicting gods: horned crowns, flowing beards, elaborate robes, poses of power or blessing. If these were memories of actual aliens, we would expect to see technological devices, spacecraft, or equipment. Instead, we see religious symbolism: gods holding measuring rods and rings symbolizing divine authority, gods with flowing streams of water representing fertility, gods with weapons representing military power. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for ancient astronaut theories is the so-called helicopter hieroglyphs from Egypt or the astronaut of Palenque from Maya culture. Similar claims have been made about Mesopotamian artifacts. In every case, careful analysis by experts has shown these to be either pareidolia, seeing patterns that aren't really there, artistic conventions misunderstood by modern viewers, or in some cases, palimpsests where older carvings were partially erased and carved over, creating accidental combinations that look strange to us. The burden of proof in scholarship rests with those making extraordinary claims. Sitchin claimed that mainstream archaeology has completely misunderstood ancient Mesopotamia, that translations by hundreds of scholars over more than a century are wrong, that the Anunnaki were actually aliens. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Sitchin provided no credible evidence, only mistranslations and misinterpretations. Professional archaeologists don't reject Sitchin's work because they're close-minded or because they're protecting some establishment narrative. They reject it because it doesn't meet the standards of evidence and methodology that any credible scholarship must meet. His translations are demonstrably wrong. His astronomical claims are false. His biological arguments are nonsensical. His historical reconstructions ignore overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The scientific method requires that hypotheses be testable and falsifiable. Sitchin's theories fail these tests. When evidence contradicts his claims, he doesn't revise his theories. He dismisses the evidence or invents ad hoc explanations. This isn't how scholarship works. Real archaeologists and historians constantly revise their understanding based on new evidence. They publish their methods so others can check their work. They engage with criticism and adjust their conclusions when shown to be wrong. Sitchin did none of this. He published popular books rather than submitting his work to peer review. He didn't engage substantively with scholarly criticism. When experts pointed out errors in his translations, he ignored them or dismissed them as narrow-minded. This is the behavior of someone promoting a belief system, not someone engaged in honest intellectual inquiry. The tragedy is that Sitchin's fabrications have overshadowed the genuine wonders of Mesopotamian civilization. The real story of the Anunnaki, of the religious beliefs that shaped the world's first literate civilization, is fascinating enough without alien embellishment. The actual achievements of the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, accomplished through human effort and ingenuity, deserve recognition rather than being attributed to extraterrestrials. When we look at the great ziggurats rising from the Mesopotamian plain, we should marvel at human engineering, at the organizational capacity required to coordinate thousands of workers, at the mathematical knowledge needed to create structures that would stand for millennia. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we should appreciate the sophisticated literary artistry, the profound meditation on mortality and meaning, the cultural achievement of creating enduring literature. When we study cuneiform tablets, we should be amazed that humans invented writing, that they preserved their thoughts and records in ways that have survived thousands of years. These achievements lose none of their wonder when we understand them as human rather than alien-assisted. If anything, they become more impressive. The Mesopotamians weren't primitive people who needed extraterrestrial help. They were innovative, intelligent, creative humans who built something extraordinary from mud and water and human effort. The ancient astronaut narrative, for all its popularity, is ultimately disrespectful to the peoples whose achievements it claims to explain. It says that Africans couldn't have built the pyramids, that Mesoamericans couldn't have developed sophisticated astronomy and mathematics, that Mesopotamians couldn't have invented writing and civilization. It denies human capacity and human accomplishment. The scholarly response to pseudo-archaeology like Sitchin's has evolved over the years. Initially, many academics felt that engaging with such work was beneath them, that it didn't deserve serious response. This attitude allowed pseudo-archaeology to flourish unchallenged in popular culture. More recently, scholars have recognized the importance of public engagement, of making real archaeological knowledge accessible and addressing false claims directly. Books like Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries by Kenneth Fader provide comprehensive debunkings of various pseudo-archaeological claims. Websites like Jason Colavito's blog and podcasts like The Archaeology Show offer accessible discussions of real archaeology while addressing pseudo-archaeological claims. Academic institutions have begun taking science communication more seriously, training scholars to engage with public audiences effectively. This shift is important because the battle over how we understand the past matters. Historical knowledge shapes identity, informs policy, and influences how we see ourselves and others. When false narratives about the past gain widespread acceptance, it affects everything from education to cultural understanding to political discourse. The Anunnaki, properly understood, offer genuine insights into how ancient peoples understood their world, what they valued, what they feared, and how they made sense of existence. They don't need to be aliens to be interesting. They're fascinating precisely because they're human creations, reflections of the hopes, fears, and imaginative capacity of the world's first great civilization. Understanding the real Anunnaki requires patient study, careful translation, and intellectual honesty. It requires resisting the temptation to read modern concerns back into ancient texts, to see what we want to see rather than what's actually there. It requires respecting the alterity of the past, acknowledging that ancient peoples thought differently than we do, valued different things, and organized their worlds according to different principles. This kind of understanding is harder than accepting simple narratives about ancient aliens. It requires nuance, tolerance for ambiguity, and willingness to say, "We don't know," when evidence is unclear. But the reward is genuine knowledge, real insight into a civilization that laid the foundations for so much that came after. The night grows deeper. Outside your window the world is quiet. Your breathing has slowed, steady and calm. You've traveled far tonight, back through time to the banks of ancient rivers, into temples where incense smoke curled around stone gods, through markets where merchants argued prices in languages dead for millennia. We've explored the true history of the Anunnaki, separating fact from fiction, reality from fantasy. But before we part, before sleep takes you fully, let's consider why any of this matters. Why should we care about getting ancient history right? Why does it matter if some people believe the Anunnaki were aliens? It matters because the past shapes the present. How we understand ancient civilizations affects how we see human potential, human diversity, and human achievement. When we attribute ancient accomplishments to aliens, we diminish human capacity. We suggest that people of the past, particularly non-European peoples, couldn't have achieved greatness without outside help. This narrative, however unintentionally, reinforces prejudices and misunderstandings. The real history of Mesopotamia shows something more valuable than any ancient astronaut fantasy. It shows what humans can accomplish. These were people who faced enormous challenges. They lived in a harsh environment that demanded constant effort to sustain life. They had no modern technology, no computers or machinery, no scientific knowledge in the modern sense. Yet they created the world's first cities, invented writing, developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, created enduring literature, and built structures that still stand after 5,000 years. They did this through cooperation, through accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation, through creativity and determination. They developed irrigation systems that transformed desert into farmland. They created social organizations complex enough to coordinate the labor of thousands. They invented accounting systems that could track vast temple economies. They observed the stars with such precision that they could predict eclipses. These achievements were entirely human. They required no alien intervention, no ancient astronauts, no advanced technology from the stars. They required human intelligence, human effort, and human community. Recognizing this is essential to understanding our own potential. Understanding the Anunnaki as gods rather than aliens also teaches us about the diversity of human religious thought. The Mesopotamian worldview was profoundly different from modern monotheistic religions. The gods were neither all good nor all powerful. They were many rather than one. They could be capricious, fallible, even unjust. Yet within this framework, the Mesopotamians found meaning, organized their societies, and created ethical systems that guided behavior. This religious diversity matters in our increasingly interconnected world. When we understand that different cultures have conceived of the divine in radically different ways, we become more capable of respecting religious differences in the present. We see that there's no single right way to think about ultimate questions, that humans have always grappled with meaning and purpose in various ways. The Mesopotamian emphasis on serving the gods through labor, through maintaining temples and agricultural lands, reflects their economic and social reality. It wasn't arbitrary or primitive. It was a worldview that made sense of their lives, that gave purpose to their efforts, that connected individual existence to cosmic order. We might not share this worldview, but we can respect it as a legitimate human response to the challenges of existence. Learning accurate history also develops critical thinking skills. When we learn to distinguish credible archaeological evidence from pseudo-archaeological fantasy, we're practicing skills applicable far beyond ancient history. We're learning to evaluate sources, to check credentials, to distinguish between evidence-based conclusions and baseless speculation. These skills matter in an age of misinformation, where social media spreads false claims as easily as true ones. The popularity of ancient astronaut theories should concern us not because people are stupid or gullible, but because it reveals failures in education and science communication. When people find pseudo-archaeology more compelling than real archaeology, it suggests that real archaeology isn't being presented in engaging, accessible ways. This is a challenge that scholars and educators must address. The genuine story of human civilization's development is endlessly fascinating. The agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, the invention of writing, the development of complex societies, all of this represents one of the great transformations in human history. It happened not because aliens taught us, but because human populations grew, because climate changed at the end of the Ice Age, because people innovated and adapted and learned from each other. We can trace these developments archaeologically. We can see the gradual domestication of plants and animals. We can observe how pottery styles evolved. We can track the spread of technologies through trade networks. We can watch as small villages grew into towns and then into cities. It's a complex, messy human story, far more interesting than any simplistic narrative about aliens creating civilization overnight. The Mesopotamians themselves left us their own testimony about who they were and what they believed. In thousands of clay tablets, they speak to us across the millennia. They tell us about their gods, their kings, their daily lives, their hopes and fears. They preserve their literature, their laws, their business records, their prayers. This is an incredible gift, this direct connection to people who lived 5,000 years ago. When we read these texts accurately, when we respect what they actually say rather than imposing our own fantasies onto them, we honor the people who wrote them. We allow them to speak in their own voices rather than putting alien words in their mouths. This is what historical study at its best should do: recover authentic voices from the past and let them tell their own stories. The study of ancient Mesopotamia has revealed so much about the foundations of later civilizations. Biblical stories drew on Mesopotamian sources. Greek philosophers studied Babylonian astronomy. The Roman calendar derived from Mesopotamian timekeeping. Islamic scholars preserved and built upon Babylonian mathematical knowledge. The influence of Mesopotamian civilization echoes through time, shaping cultures across continents. Recognizing these connections helps us understand that human civilization is cumulative and interconnected. Knowledge passes from culture to culture, building and evolving. What the Mesopotamians learned about astronomy informed later astronomical work. What they developed in mathematics became foundation for further advances. What they created in literature inspired later literature. We are all, in various ways, heirs to Mesopotamian civilization. This interconnection of human cultures matters in our globalized world. When we understand how much different civilizations have learned from each other, how knowledge has flowed across boundaries, we become less susceptible to nationalist or isolationist narratives. We see that human progress has always depended on cultural exchange, on people learning from each other, on ideas crossing borders. The Anunnaki, in their historical reality as Mesopotamian gods, represent one chapter in humanity's long attempt to understand existence, to create meaning, to organize society, to relate to powers beyond human control. They aren't the only such attempt. Every culture has developed religious systems, mythologies, and cosmologies that served similar functions. Studying these systems comparatively reveals both human diversity and human commonality. We're diverse in the specific forms our religions and mythologies take, but we're united in asking the same fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? What is just? What is beautiful? What is sacred? The Mesopotamian answers to these questions, preserved in their myths about the Anunnaki and other gods, represent one set of responses. They're not our responses, but they're worthy of respect and study. They show the creativity of human religious imagination, the depth of human philosophical questioning, and the variety of ways humans have organized meaning. In our modern world, with its complex challenges and rapid changes, we need historical perspective more than ever. Understanding how past societies developed, how they dealt with challenges, how they created order from chaos, can inform our own struggles. The Mesopotamians built the first complex urban societies. They dealt with issues of resource management, social organization, inequality, environmental stress, and cultural change. Their responses weren't always successful, but they provide case studies in human adaptation and innovation. The collapse of various Mesopotamian civilizations also teaches valuable lessons. Environmental degradation through over-irrigation led to soil salinization that reduced agricultural productivity. Political instability created opportunities for invasion. Climate changes affected food production. These are not just ancient problems. They're issues we still face, and understanding how past societies dealt with them or failed to deal with them can inform our own choices. But beyond any practical applications, there's intrinsic value in understanding the past accurately. Knowledge has worth for its own sake. The story of human civilization, in all its complexity and diversity, is worth knowing simply because it's our story. The Mesopotamians were our ancestors in a broad sense, pioneers who developed many of the foundations on which later civilizations built. They deserve to be remembered accurately, to have their achievements recognized, to have their voices heard as they actually spoke rather than as ancient astronaut theorists imagine them. They don't need to be aliens to be important. Their humanity is what makes them significant. As you drift toward sleep, let the real story of the Anunnaki accompany you into dreams. Not fantasies of ancient astronauts, but the genuine wonder of human religious imagination. Picture those ancient temples rising from the plain, their mud brick walls massive and enduring. Imagine the priests climbing the ziggurat stairs at dawn, bringing offerings to the god whose statue waited in the shrine. Hear the prayers and hymns in languages that seem strange to us but were daily speech to those who lived then. The Anunnaki were gods who shaped how millions of people understood their world. They were the structure of meaning, the framework of cosmic order, the beings who decreed fates and demanded service. They were cultural creations of incredible richness, products of sophisticated theological thinking, expressions of human wonder at the mysteries of existence. They were never aliens. They were always gods. And the civilization that created them was always human, in all the creativity and brilliance that humanity is capable of achieving. If you've enjoyed this journey through ancient history, if you've learned something new about the Anunnaki and Mesopotamia, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button to let me know this content resonates with you. Share this video with anyone who might be interested in the real history of ancient civilizations, anyone who's encountered ancient astronaut theories and wants to know what the evidence actually says. In future videos we'll explore other ancient civilizations, other myths that have been misinterpreted, other genuine wonders of human achievement. We'll continue separating fact from fiction, reality from fantasy, always with respect for the peoples of the past and commitment to understanding them as they truly were. For now, let sleep take you. Let your mind rest from this long journey through millennia. Tomorrow brings new days, new challenges, new opportunities. But tonight, you've walked with the ancients, glimpsed their world, heard their stories. You've honored them by seeking truth rather than settling for comfortable fictions. The Anunnaki watch over you now, not as aliens from a distant planet, but as what they always were, the great gods of the world's first civilization, products of human imagination, reflections of human hopes and fears, inhabitants of the sacred stories that gave meaning to life between two ancient rivers. Sleep well, dream well, and remember that the truth, when we take the time to discover it, is always more wonderful than any fiction we could invent. Good night.